Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. Dead waves. I had always been drawn to the ocean. Growing up in California, the sea had been a constant in my life, vast, endless, and mysterious. It was the kind of place where you could lose yourself, where the sound of the waves crashing against the shore drowned out everything else. But recently, something had changed. The ocean wasn't the same. The waves were different, as if the sea itself had become something unnatural. It started with whispers among the locals. First, it was just rumors, strange occurrences on the beaches, reports of boats disappearing without a trace, and an unsettling stillness in the air before the waves crashed. I had heard it all before. People talked about the sea in superstitious tones, blaming the storms for the tides or some mysterious force beyond our understanding. But there was something about the way they spoke, the fear in their eyes, that made me pay attention. I remember the day it all changed. I was out on the pier, watching the waves as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The sky was a brilliant mix of oranges and reds, the light bouncing off the water in a way that should have been calming, but instead, it felt off. Something in the air was wrong, heavy, almost like the ocean was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, though I was surrounded by people. Then it happened, the first wave. It came out of nowhere, taller and darker than anything I had ever seen before. It didn't behave like normal waves. It wasn't rolling in, crashing onto the shore as expected. Instead, it surged forward with a deliberate, almost menacing force, as if it had a mind of its own. The beachgoers didn't even have time to react. The wave was upon them in an instant, swallowing everything in its path, boats, people, debris, all vanishing without a trace. I stood frozen, unable to move, watching the chaos unfold before me. The sky above seemed to darken, as if the sun itself had been consumed by the ocean. The air was thick with salt water and the unmistakable scent of decay. I could hear the panic from the shoreline, the desperate cries of those who had survived, but I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the water, from that endless expanse of dark waves, each one higher, more forceful than the last. Get inside. Now, a voice shouted, pulling me from my stupor. I turned to see one of the lifeguards, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. He was motioning for me to follow him, but I couldn't move. The sight of the water was hypnotic, terrifying, like a siren song calling me to the depths. It wasn't just the size of the waves that terrified me. It was the way they seemed to pulse, as if they were alive, growing in power with each crash. And worse, they didn't retreat. They hovered, rolling back and forth just beyond the shoreline, as if waiting for something or someone. Something in the pit of my stomach told me this was just the beginning. As I finally turned and followed the lifeguard into the safety of the building, I couldn't help but wonder what kind of force was controlling these waves. What had caused this anomaly to emerge so suddenly, and why was it growing more violent with every passing moment? I needed answers. But the more I tried to make sense of it, the more I realized that I was just beginning to scratch the surface of something far darker, far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. The night came quickly, wrapping the world in a cloak of darkness, but the waves didn't cease. They continued to crash relentlessly against the shore, an eerie, rhythmic pounding that seemed to vibrate through my bones. The unnatural pulse of the water felt as though it was reaching out, calling to something, perhaps to all of us who stood too close, too curious. I couldn't sleep. How could I? The sound of the waves was deafening, like a constant reminder that something was horribly wrong. My mind raced with questions, each one leading to a darker, more unsettling thought. I had lived near the ocean all my life, but I had never seen anything like this. These weren't ordinary waves. These weren't the playful swells of the beach I knew and loved. No, these waves were wrong. They felt alive. I had heard whispers about strange occurrences before, but nothing had ever been like this. People spoke of things that didn't make sense, disappearances, objects appearing on the beach that couldn't possibly have washed up, creatures no one could identify, and sometimes the ocean itself seemed to shift, to take on a life of its own. The lifeguard, a man named Matt, had been the one to get me to safety that day. But when I asked him what he thought was happening, his response chilled me to the core. He simply shook his head, his eyes distant, as though he didn't have the words to explain what he had seen. "There's something out there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something we don't understand. Something that's not natural." I wanted to ask him more, but he had turned away, his gaze fixated on the ocean. He looked lost, as if he was trying to understand something that defied explanation. It was then that I noticed something even more disturbing. The water, which had been dark and turbulent, was now completely still, as if frozen in time. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel it pressing against me, making it hard to breathe. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't tear myself away. I had to know more. I had to understand what was happening. The following days didn't bring any relief. The waves continued to grow, each one more powerful than the last, and the people on the beach became more and more desperate. Some left, unable to shake the feeling that something terrible was coming. Others stayed, hoping against hope that it was just a freak anomaly, that the ocean would return to its normal rhythm. But I knew better. These weren't just strange waves. They were a signal. Something had been disturbed, and the ocean was now trying to warn us. I decided to venture out to the pier again, hoping to get closer to the water, to see if I could understand what was causing this madness. I walked along the empty, quiet beach, the moonlight casting long shadows over the sand. The only sounds were the soft crunch of my footsteps and the distant crash of the waves. It was unnervingly quiet, the world feeling out of balance, like I was walking through a dream or a nightmare. When I reached the end of the pier, I stopped. The water stretched out before me, black and vast. And there, on the horizon, I could see it. The outline of something beneath the waves, moving just below the surface. It was massive, impossibly large, and it moved with a slow, deliberate grace. My heart began to pound in my chest as I stared at it, my mind racing. I tried to rationalize it. It was just a ship, maybe, or a large school of fish. But there was something in the way it moved, the way it shifted through the water, that felt all wrong. And then, as if it sensed my gaze, it stopped. For a moment, everything was still. The waves froze, and the night was eerily silent. It was as though the ocean was holding its breath. And then, it surged forward. A massive wave, larger than anything I had seen before, rose from the depths, its crest reaching high into the sky. It was coming straight for the pier. My heart slammed in my chest as I turned to run, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. I could hear it now, the unmistakable roar of the water as it grew closer, closer, until it was all I could hear, all I could feel. The world blurred around me as I raced for safety. I didn't know if I could make it, but I had to try. And then, just as the wave crashed down on me, everything went black. When I came to, I didn't know where I was. The sound of the ocean, that ever-present roar, was gone. Instead, a thick, suffocating silence wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. My body ached all over, as if it had been torn apart and pieced back together, but my mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. The last thing I remembered was the wave, its monstrous force about to crush everything in its path. But now, there was no water, no crashing sound, no chaos. Just the eerie, still quiet. I struggled to sit up, blinking against the confusion clouding my thoughts. I was on the beach, or what I thought was the beach. The ground beneath me felt strange, softer, almost spongy. And the sky, it wasn't right. The stars were too bright, too close, as if they were pressing in from above. The air tasted different, too thick with an odd, metallic tang. My breath caught in my throat. I was still in the same place, but nothing was the same. Slowly, I rose to my feet, my legs unsteady. I looked around, trying to orient myself, but everything felt off. The beach stretched out before me, but the sand had a strange shimmer to it, almost as if it were alive, pulsing with an energy I couldn't explain. I began to walk, my feet sinking slightly into the ground with each step. My heart pounded louder in my chest with every footfall. The beach was deserted, no sign of life, no signs of the people I had seen earlier. Not even the lifeguard. There was just me, and the unsettling stillness that seemed to press in from all sides. I kept moving, driven by an urge I didn't fully understand, an instinct that whispered to me that I had to keep going. The waves were gone, but something else, something far more sinister, was here. I could feel it in my bones, in the way the air shifted, in the way the very ground beneath me seemed to hum with an unnatural force. And then I saw it. A shape in the distance, half buried in the sand, just at the edge of the waterline. It was large, metallic, but not a ship. No, this was something else. Something foreign, something that didn't belong here. My pulse quickened as I made my way toward it, my feet scraping against the strange sand. As I drew closer, I realized what it was, a vessel of some kind, but unlike anything I had ever seen. Its surface was smooth and dark, reflecting the distorted light in an almost unnatural way. There were no markings on it, no signs of identification, just this sleek, alien object that seemed to shimmer like it was alive. I reached out to touch it, my hand trembling, but before I could, a voice interrupted my thoughts. "You shouldn't be here." The words were sharp, like the crack of thunder in a storm. I whipped around, my heart skipping a beat, but there was no one. The voice had come from nowhere and everywhere. It echoed in my mind, cold and insistent. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. There was only the pulse of the strange vessel, the hum in the air, and the oppressive silence that hung heavily around me. The voice came again, louder this time, more insistent. "You shouldn't be here. Leave now." Panic set in. I turned, but the landscape had shifted. The beach I had known was gone. The horizon was blurred, and the sky stretched at unnatural angles. Everything was closing in on me, warping and twisting, as though the very fabric of reality was bending around me. I stumbled back toward the water, my legs shaking. I had to get away from this place, but no matter how far I ran, it felt as though the distance stretched farther and farther, the world folding in on itself. The beach seemed endless, the sand beneath my feet sinking deeper with every step, pulling me into the earth. But still, I ran. I had to get away. I couldn't stay here any longer. I finally stopped, gasping for breath, my mind spinning. The voice, if it was even a voice, was gone now, but its warning lingered, echoing in the corners of my mind. I looked back toward the strange vessel, the pulsating hum now a distant murmur. That's why I saw it. A figure, standing in the distance, just at the edge of the water. It was humanoid in shape, but its proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin. Its features were indistinct, a blur of shifting shadows and light. And then it moved. It didn't walk. It glided, as if it were floating just above the sand, its form shifting with each step, warping and distorting like a mirage. My heart slammed against my chest as I took a step back. It was coming closer, its presence growing more intense with each passing second. I had no idea what it was, but I knew one thing for certain: it was not human. The air around me seemed to vibrate, the ground beneath my feet trembling. My thoughts were a blur of panic, but I knew I had to run. I had to get away from this thing, whatever it was, before it reached me. I turned, stumbling once more, but the world was collapsing. The beach, the water, the sky, they were all warping together, folding into themselves, as if the fabric of reality was being torn apart at the seams. And then, there was nothing. I woke up to the sound of water. The rush of it was all around me, crashing against some unseen shore. But the feeling of weightlessness, the lack of the usual sensation of the earth beneath me, was what struck me first. I opened my eyes slowly, trying to make sense of where I was, but everything was blurred. My head throbbed, my body felt heavy, and the coldness of the water seeped into my skin, numbing my limbs. It took me a moment to realize I was floating, or rather, suspended in some liquid. Panic surged within me as I tried to move, my limbs sluggish and uncooperative. I was submerged, or nearly, in water that wasn't the sea anymore. It didn't feel right, too still, too thick, as though the water had changed, become something else entirely. It didn't matter that I could breathe, or that the liquid wasn't suffocating me. The sensation of being trapped, of not knowing where I was or how I got here, was enough to send my mind spiraling. I began to thrash, my hands brushing against the surface around me, only to feel a soft resistance, almost as though the air itself had a physical texture, pressing in on me from all sides. My heart hammered in my chest as I fought against it, pushing, kicking, but nothing seemed to help. The more I struggled, the thicker the air became, pressing harder against me until I felt as though I might suffocate from the weight of it all. Stop. The voice was the same one that had spoken to me before, though this time it wasn't just in my head. It was real, coming from everywhere. The words reverberated in my skull, settling like a cold weight. I froze, terrified. The voice continued, more insistent now. Do not fight it. Do not resist. The words were clear, but their meaning was anything but. What was this place? Why was I here? The questions swirled in my mind, growing louder with each passing second. Slowly, the pressure began to lift. The sensation of the air pressing in on me loosened, just enough to let me breathe freely again. My eyes darted around, searching for any sign of life, anything to explain what was happening. But there was nothing. Nothing except the water, the oppressive silence, and the sensation of something watching me from beyond the surface. I was floating in a vast expanse of liquid, surrounded by an endless, unbroken darkness. There was no horizon, no sky, only an abyss. Where am I? I croaked, my voice sounding alien in the thick air. The words echoed, bouncing off unseen walls that stretched in all directions. Where you are does not matter. It is what you do next that will decide everything. A shiver ran down my spine. What was that supposed to mean? I tried to sit up, but my movements were slow, sluggish, as though I was still fighting against the resistance of the air around me. But the voice, it was calm, soothing even, and yet it held an undeniable authority, like it knew things I couldn't even begin to comprehend. Do not struggle. The tide is not a thing to fight, the voice continued, its tone soft but unwavering. The tide is already here. It has always been here. You simply didn't notice. I tried to make sense of the words, but they only made my head spin. The tide? What tide? The ocean had been empty, deserted. But this was something else. Something darker, more suffocating. And it was waiting. Suddenly, a shift in the water beneath me pulled my attention away from the voice. I felt the current move, but it wasn't natural. It was slow, deliberate, as if the ocean itself had become aware of my presence. The dark water began to move in unnatural patterns, swirling around me in tight, circular motions. I held my breath, my eyes scanning the blackness, expecting something to emerge. The current grew stronger, the movement faster, and my body began to drift, pulled by an invisible force deeper into the abyss. The voice was gone now, leaving only the oppressive hum of the water and the strange pull that was growing stronger with every passing moment. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady myself, to calm the panic that was rising in my chest. But when I opened them again, the world around me had changed. There, emerging from the water, was something new. A shape. It was large, a mass of dark shadows that seemed to swirl and shift with the movement of the liquid. I could barely make out its true form. It was constantly changing, like it didn't want to be seen, or perhaps couldn't be. But I knew, deep down, that whatever it was the cause of all this. It was the force behind the tides, the waves, and the pull that had dragged me into this unearthly place. The water continued to swirl around me, tightening its grip with every passing second. I could feel the heat of the thing approaching, even though the water around me remained icy cold. The closer it came, the more I felt my body resist. My mind screamed for me to move, to escape, but the pressure, the weight of the liquid, kept me frozen in place. Do you understand now? The voice whispered again, but this time it was different. It was colder, more distant. You cannot escape. You never could. The thing in the water was closer now. I could feel its presence more than see it. My eyes darted in every direction, trying to catch a glimpse of it, but it remained elusive, shifting in and out of the shadows. The water was cold, yet my body burned with a feverish heat, as if it knew what was coming. My heart hammered in my chest, and I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the thick, oppressive silence. Panic surged within me as I realized that my voice couldn't reach out. The air around me had thickened again, pressing against my chest as though the atmosphere itself was fighting to crush me. The darkness pressed in closer, and the pull of the water grew stronger, as if it was pulling me towards something far deeper than I could comprehend. My body trembled, struggling to hold on to what little sense of control I had left. I clawed at the water, my fingers brushing against something smooth and cold beneath the surface, something that didn't feel like part of the ocean at all. Something unnatural. I gasped as the dark shape finally revealed itself. It wasn't a creature, at least not in the way I had expected. It was a mass of swirling, liquid shadows, an entity that seemed to be made of pure darkness, with no distinct form or boundary. It moved with purpose, gliding through the water with an unnatural grace, and the closer it got, the more the water around me seemed to hum, vibrating with an energy I couldn't understand. "It has come," the voice whispered again, its tone laced with finality. It was as if the ocean itself was speaking, or perhaps something far older and more ancient. I could feel its presence pressing in on me, suffocating me. I tried to push away, to swim to the surface, but the current was far too strong. My limbs felt heavy, like I was fighting against a force greater than myself. I could barely move, my body sinking deeper, the darkness closing in around me. And then, for a fleeting moment, I saw it. A flash of light, a flicker in the shadows, and I realized with a sickening certainty that it wasn't a creature I was facing, it was a consciousness. A being that existed beyond time, beyond space. A presence that had been watching me, waiting for me to finally understand the truth. It wasn't the ocean that was the threat. It wasn't the waves or the tide. It was the force that controlled them, the force that had manipulated time and space, pulling everything into this endless loop of decay. I had been chosen, not to survive, but to witness. "Do you see now?" The voice was almost kind, as if it pitied me. "This world is not what you thought it was. Time is not what you thought it was. There is no escape from the tide, no escape from what comes with it." I tried to scream again, but the words wouldn't come. The water had reached my neck, and then my mouth, pushing against my chest until it was all I could do to breathe. It was as if the very ocean was closing in on me, swallowing me whole, dragging me into its depths where nothing could ever escape. I felt my body being pulled under, my vision blurring, the darkness becoming all-consuming. But just before it claimed me completely, I saw something. A crack in the water, a fleeting glimpse of the shore, distant and unreachable. It was a final, desperate thought that flickered in my mind, the last spark of my will to survive. And then everything went dark. The waves crashed against the shore, relentless and unchanging. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie light over the water. There was no sign of the wreckage, no sign of what had happened. Only the quiet hum of the ocean, as though nothing had changed. But somewhere, in the depths of the sea, a new tide began to rise. The waves were dead, but their force was far from gone. And the earth would never be the same. Sounds beneath. I had been working in the mines of South Carolina for years, but those sounds were different. It wasn't the usual creaking of the timber or the rhythmic thumping of pickaxes against rock. No, this was something else. It started innocently enough. A faint tapping, almost like fingers on the wall, deep beneath the earth. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a product of the long shifts and the isolation that came with working in the mines. But then, it happened again. And again. Like a whisper, calling out from the depths. "Did you hear that?" I asked Thomas, one of the men I worked with. He looked at me with an uneasy frown. "It's probably just the rocks shifting," he said, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. Thomas had been here longer than me, but even he was starting to act different. The quiet hum of the earth was becoming more unsettling, and we were all feeling it. The sounds grew louder with each passing day. I began to hear more than just tapping. There were voices, too, low and unintelligible, echoing through the tunnels. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I felt a deep, primal fear settle on my chest whenever they came. It was as if something, or someone, was waiting for us down there, calling us closer with each whisper. At first, the crew tried to ignore it. We had work to do, after all. The mining had to continue. But the strange occurrences didn't stop. Men started to go missing, vanishing without a trace. At first, it was just a man or two. People thought they had run off or had an accident. But then it happened more frequently. I remember the first time it really hit me, that something was wrong. It was late at night, and we were deeper than usual, looking for a new vein of coal. I was at the front, holding my lantern, when I heard it, clearer than ever. A low moan that seemed to rise from the depths of the earth itself. I froze, the light from my lantern flickering wildly as the sound grew louder, more distinct. "Did you hear that?" I asked again, my voice barely above a whisper. Thomas looked nervous, his face pale in the dim light. "We need to get out of here. Now." Before I could even respond, the ground trembled beneath our feet. A rumble that seemed to come from the very core of the earth, vibrating through the walls of the tunnel. The floor cracked open with a sharp snap, sending a cascade of dust and dirt into the air. Then the sound, it shifted. It wasn't a moan anymore. It was a voice, a clear, distinct whisper, almost like a command. "Leave, now." I turned to Thomas, my mind racing. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. "It's coming," he whispered, barely audible over the sound of the shaking earth. "What's coming?" I asked, my voice trembling. Before he could answer, the ground shook violently once more, and everything went dark. I woke up lying on the cold, damp ground. The lantern was out, but the faint glow of the emergency lights from the mine entrance gave me just enough to see. My head throbbed, and I could taste dirt in my mouth. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, as if the earth itself was pushing down on me. "Thomas?" I croaked, looking around. There was no answer. The only sound was the faint drip of water from somewhere deep in the mine and the distant hum of machinery far above us. I struggled to get up, my legs unsteady, but I finally managed to stand. I called out again. "Thomas." Still nothing. The silence was overwhelming, and that's when I realized Thomas was gone. He had been standing right next to me when everything went dark. My pulse quickened, and panic began to creep in. What had happened? Was he buried? Had the ground swallowed him up? I stumbled forward, my hands reaching out for the walls of the tunnel. The tremor had caused a collapse, but it didn't look like anything massive. Just a few loose rocks, nothing that should have kept anyone from moving. Then I heard it again. The whisper. Soft and indistinct at first, like the murmur of a distant crowd. I froze. The voice had changed. It was no longer the faint moan, but now it was something else. Something deliberate. "Help us." The sound echoed off the walls, a ripple through the earth that made my skin crawl. I couldn't tell if it was coming from the depths or if it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, to run as fast as I could. But I couldn't. Not yet. I needed to find Thomas. I needed to understand what was happening. So, despite the rising fear, I moved forward. The tunnels twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the mine. The deeper I went, the louder the whispers became. It was as if the earth itself was alive, breathing, speaking. I couldn't make out the words, but the presence was undeniable. It was everywhere now. In the walls. In the air. "Where are you, Thomas?" I muttered, trying to steady my breath. I reached a fork in the tunnel, and I hesitated. There were two paths ahead, and the whispers seemed to come from both. My heart pounded in my chest. I had no way of knowing which way Thomas had gone, or if he was even still alive. A sudden noise broke my train of thought. A scraping sound, like metal on stone, coming from the left tunnel. My heart skipped a beat. "Thomas?" I called, stepping cautiously toward the noise. No response. The scraping continued, growing louder with every step I took. The closer I got, the more my breath caught in my throat. I could feel something watching me. Something waiting. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was Thomas. But not Thomas as I remembered him. His eyes were wide, wild with terror, and his face was pale, his skin almost gray. He didn't speak. He just stood there, trembling, as if rooted to the spot. The whispers had stopped, but in their place was something worse, an eerie, deafening silence. The kind of silence that felt wrong, as though the world had stopped turning. "Thomas, what happened?" I asked, stepping closer, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he slowly raised his hand, pointing down the tunnel. I followed his finger, and what I saw froze me in place. At the far end of the tunnel, barely visible in the dim light, was a doorway. But it wasn't like any doorway I'd ever seen before. It was a jagged hole in the rock, as though the earth had torn itself apart. And beyond it, a faint glow pulsated, casting long shadows across the walls. The whispering, "No," the voices, were coming from there. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. Thomas didn't answer, but his shaking intensified. He took a step back, away from the glow, his feet scraping against the stone floor. And then, in the most chilling tone, he spoke. "It's not real," he said, his voice cracked, his eyes wide with terror. "None of it's real." I opened my mouth to speak, to ask what he meant, but before I could, the ground shook again. This time, it was different. The rumble was deeper, more violent. The walls trembled and dust fell from the ceiling. I tried to hold my ground, but my body betrayed me. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. The glow in the tunnel grew brighter, stronger. And then, with a deafening crack, the entire tunnel seemed to split open. The earth groaned. The sound wasn't just a vibration now, it was alive, and it was angry. The ground beneath me shook violently. My body lurched to the side, crashing into the jagged walls of the mine. I gasped, struggling to regain my footing. The air was thick with dust, and the once familiar tunnel had become a cavernous nightmare. The faint glow at the end of the tunnel pulsed erratically, like the beating of some monstrous heart beneath the earth. I turned toward Thomas. His face was a mask of fear, his mouth moving, but no words came out. His hand still pointed toward the doorway, trembling as if it wasn't just a signal but a warning. Then, the sound came again. Not the whispers. This was different. It was a low, rumbling growl, deep and guttural, as though something enormous and hungry was stirring beneath the earth, waking from a long slumber. I felt it in my bones, the vibration of the sound coursing through me. It wasn't natural. "Thomas!" I shouted over the noise, but he didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the glowing doorway, his lips twitching as though he were trapped in some kind of trance. I reached out, grabbing his arm. "We have to go. Now!" But before he could react, the ground shook again, harder this time. The tunnel's walls groaned, cracking under the strain, and the ceiling above us seemed to buckle. Dust poured down, and the lights flickered as if the mine itself was alive, dying with each passing moment. Then it happened. The doorway at the end of the tunnel, no, not a doorway, I realized now, was a fissure, a tear in the fabric of the world. It opened wider with an ear-splitting crack, sending a wave of heat rushing toward us. The pulsating light intensified, bathing the mine in an unnatural glow. The growl became louder, and suddenly, the noise wasn't just coming from the tunnel. It was coming from everywhere. From deep below, from the walls, from the very air itself. I felt the fear building in my chest, suffocating me. There was no escape. The voices, the vibrations, the growl. It was all pulling me in, as if the very earth wanted to swallow us whole. Run! I screamed, dragging Thomas along, but he wouldn't budge. He was rooted to the spot, his eyes wide, his face twisted in horror. No! No! He muttered, his voice barely a whisper. It's too late. You have to leave, you don't understand. It's too late for all of us. I shook him violently. Thomas, listen to me. We can't stay here. Whatever that is, we need to get out. Now! But he didn't respond. His body went limp in my grip, and I had no choice but to let him go. He staggered backward, eyes never leaving the opening in the tunnel. The glow was brighter now, an unnatural intensity that made my skin crawl. I turned, my instincts taking over. There was only one way out. I couldn't let Thomas stop me. Not now. I had to survive. I started running. My boots scraped against the rough stone, and the echoes of my footsteps were swallowed by the growl that reverberated through the earth. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, but the walls felt like they were closing in. The ceiling above me groaned, as if something massive was pushing against it, trying to break free. And then I heard it. A sound that made my blood freeze. A scream. Not Thomas's. It was deeper, raspier. The voice of something, not human. Something that had no place in this world. I glanced back, my heart pounding in my chest. The glow from the fissure had spread, and I could see figures now. Shadows emerging from the tunnel. They were not human. Not even close. They were tall, their bodies elongated and twisted, with arms that seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if gravity itself had no hold over them. Their faces were pale, featureless, with nothing but hollow, empty eyes staring at me. Their mouths hung open, and the growl came from them, the sound vibrating in my skull. I stumbled, my legs refusing to move as I took in the sight. These things, whatever they were not meant to exist. They didn't belong in this world. And yet, here they were. The growl turned into a shriek, and in that moment, I knew that I was not meant to survive this. These things, they were waiting for us. Waiting for us to enter their domain. The first of the creatures moved toward me, its limbs stretching impossibly long, its hollow eyes locked on mine. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The tunnel felt as though it was closing in, and the only thing left was the shriek, louder and louder, until it was all I could hear. And then everything went dark. I don't know how much time passed before I regained consciousness. I was lying on the cold, uneven ground of the mine. My head throbbed with an unbearable pain, and my entire body felt as though it had been crushed beneath something heavy. I forced my eyes open, blinking rapidly against the dim light that flickered overhead. The tunnel was silent now. The growls, the shrieks, the thundering vibrations, they were gone. For a moment, I thought I had dreamed it all. But then I saw them. The figures. They stood perfectly still, as though frozen in time. Their bodies, long and twisted, were silhouetted against the faint light that flickered above, casting them in an eerie, distorted glow. There were more of them now, at least 4 or 5, but they didn't move. Not yet. I pushed myself to my feet, every muscle in my body screaming in protest. The pain in my head was unbearable, but I forced myself to move, stumbling away from the creatures. My heart raced in my chest, and every breath I took felt like it was my last. There was no time to think, no time to understand what had happened. I had to get out. The tunnel stretched before me, long and dark, with no clear end in sight. I didn't know where I was anymore, and the more I tried to focus, the more disoriented I became. It felt like the walls themselves were shifting, warping around me, the ground beneath me pulsing with a strange, unnatural energy. I looked back toward the creatures. They hadn't moved, at least not yet. They stood there, their hollow eyes staring into the darkness, as if waiting for something. But what? I couldn't stay here. I had to keep moving, even if I didn't know where I was going. The longer I lingered, the more my fear crept in. The silence was suffocating, and I couldn't help but feel that the quiet was only the calm before the storm. I began to walk, slowly at first, then faster as I tried to make sense of my surroundings. The walls seemed to bend and stretch around me, like the tunnel was alive. I could feel it. I could feel the presence of something that wasn't quite human, something ancient and powerful, waiting just beyond the veil. As I walked, I kept hearing it. A faint sound, distant but growing louder. A whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew it was calling to me. My pulse quickened, and I found myself moving faster, almost running. The whisper became clearer, and my body tensed with dread. It wasn't just a voice. It was a pull. It was as if something in the depths of the mind was trying to drag me toward it. But then, as I rounded a bend in the tunnel, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. A figure. A person. At least, that's what I thought at first. But as my eyes focused, I saw the truth. It was Thomas. Or what was left of him. His body was contorted in ways that shouldn't have been possible. His arms and legs twisted like they were made of rubber, stretching and curling in unnatural angles. His face was pale, his eyes wide open but lifeless. He stood frozen, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream. I couldn't breathe. I had to get away. I had to leave this place before I became like him. But then Thomas moved. His head jerked toward me, his hollow eyes locking onto mine. His mouth stretched wide, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. But then the growl came again. The sound was deep, resonating through the very ground beneath me. It shook the tunnel, rattling my bones. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest, and I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. All I could hear was the growl, getting louder and louder, and the footsteps, those horrible, echoing footsteps, chasing after me. I could feel the presence of those creatures behind me, their breath on my neck, but I couldn't look back. The tunnel seemed to stretch forever. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't slow down. Not when I knew what was coming. I heard the whispers again, louder now, growing clearer. The words were like a chant, repeated over and over, but I couldn't make them out. And then I saw it. The exit. It was a faint light at the end of the tunnel, barely visible through the thick darkness, but it was there. My heart surged with hope. I pushed myself harder, faster. The light grew closer. But the growl came again. This time, it was deafening. The ground shook beneath me, and I stumbled. I glanced back for a split second, and there they were. The figures. Their long arms reaching for me, their eyes wide and hollow, glowing with a malevolent light. I didn't stop. The light was so close now. One more step, and the tunnel collapsed. I felt the earth tremble beneath my feet, a low rumble that reverberated through my bones, shaking every fiber of my being. The tunnel, once stable, was coming apart, as if it couldn't bear the weight of what lurked below. The light at the end, my escape, flickered as the ceiling cracked, sending a shower of rocks tumbling down. I screamed, the sound lost in the chaos. My legs gave way beneath me as the tunnel shifted, the floor tilting and the walls closing in. Everything I had been running from, everything I had feared, was now here, pressing down on me. I scrambled to my feet, the air thick with dust, and ran toward the light. My lungs burned, every breath feeling like it could be my last. The ground beneath me was unstable, but I didn't dare stop. The whispering was louder now, a constant buzz in the back of my mind, urging me forward, but I couldn't tell if it was real or just part of the madness. I could hear them, the creatures, those twisted figures. They were closing in, their long arms scraping against the walls, their growls vibrating through the tunnel. My heart raced faster than my feet could carry me. I was almost there, just a few more steps. Then I saw it. The hole in the earth. It wasn't an exit. It was a cavern, a vast, dark space that stretched endlessly downward, as if the mine had opened up into something far more ancient and unknowable. The light at the end of the tunnel was gone now, replaced by the oppressive darkness of the cavern. But something worse followed. A shadow. A massive, black shape that loomed over the opening, blocking any chance of escape. It was no longer just a figure. It was a presence. Something so ancient, so powerful, that it felt as though it had always been there, waiting for the right moment to be unleashed. I stopped dead in my tracks. The creatures were behind me now. Their footsteps grew louder, and I could feel their breath on my back. But it wasn't them that I feared. It was the shadow. I turned, the fear choking me, my heart thumping so hard I thought it would break my ribs. But there was no escape. No way to run. The whispering was louder now, a cacophony that drowned out all other sound. It wasn't just in my head. It was coming from everywhere, echoing through the mine, filling the cavern with its maddening hum. The shadow began to move, its shape undulating, shifting like smoke. I couldn't look away. I wanted to, but my body wouldn't obey. I was paralyzed. And then the growl came again, but this time it was not from the creatures behind me. It was from the shadow. A deep, bone-rattling growl that vibrated through the air, a sound so primal that it felt like it was coming from the earth itself. The ground beneath me shook harder, and I stumbled, falling to my knees as the cavern seemed to breathe around me, the air thick with some ancient force. I saw them. The figures. They were emerging from the shadow, their twisted bodies now fully visible, their hollow eyes glowing with a sickly light. They moved toward me with deliberate slowness, their limbs dragging on the ground, their forms contorting as they advanced. My thoughts were a blur. I had to do something, but there was nothing to do. No plan. No escape. I could feel my pulse in my throat, hear the pounding of my blood, the whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. And then it happened. A crack. A burst of light. The cavern erupted with a blinding flash, and I was thrown backward, my body crashing against the jagged rocks. Pain shot through my skull, and I gasped for air, my vision spinning. For a moment, everything was silent. The creatures stopped. They froze. And then, without warning, they dissolved into the darkness, vanishing as if they had never been there. The ground stopped shaking, and the whispers died. I lay there in the rubble, my breath coming in shallow gasps, unable to move. I had survived. But something inside me was gone. Something had shifted. As I slowly pulled myself to my feet, the shadow remained. It wasn't gone. It was just waiting. Watching. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. I turned, walking toward the mine's exit, my every step heavy with the knowledge of what I had just witnessed. I didn't know I had come face to face with what dark power had been awakened beneath the earth. But I knew one thing for certain, I would never be the same. I could still hear the whispers in the back of my mind. A faint echo, always there, always waiting. The Black Bridge. It was the kind of night when the city feels more alive than usual, when the lights flicker a little too brightly, and the hum of the streets seems to echo in your bones. I had just finished my shift at the diner, the one on the edge of Brooklyn, and was driving home. The radio was playing some old jazz tune, the kind you half listen to when you're exhausted but don't mind the background noise. I wasn't expecting anything strange. But, of course, when it comes to the Black Bridge, you never do. The bridge connects two parts of the city, Brooklyn to Manhattan, through a narrow stretch of concrete suspended over the river. It's old, weathered, and often fogged in the morning. People avoid it after dark. They say it's cursed. No one really talks about it anymore, not since the accident. The accident. They say no one's crossed it at night without something tragic happening. Crashes, disappearances. Some say it's the ghosts of the past, others swear it's something darker, something alive in the bridge itself. I've crossed it countless times. Never once thought much of the rumors. But tonight was different. I turned onto the bridge, the familiar hum of my tires over the asphalt, the comforting rhythm of night driving. The city stretched out before me, lights shimmering like stars, the sound of traffic just far enough behind to feel isolated. The air was thick with moisture, a hint of something metallic in it, like rain but heavier, sharper. And then it came. A soft scraping sound. Like metal against metal, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't the tires. Not the wind. Something beneath, something in the structure of the bridge itself. I glanced in my rearview mirror, half expecting someone to be tailing me, but the road was empty. No headlights, no shadows, nothing. The bridge was deserted. I shook my head. Just my mind playing tricks. It had been a long day. I pressed on the gas, trying to push away the unease creeping in. But then, another sound. A scraping, followed by a loud thud. I froze, gripping the steering wheel. The car jolted slightly, as if something had brushed against it. I looked around, eyes darting to the sides of the bridge. The fog was heavier now, swirling in thick masses. I couldn't see the river below anymore, only a wall of gray. Another thud. I hit the brakes instinctively. The car skidded a little on the slick surface, the sound of the tires squealing too loud in the silence. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to see, maybe a shadow crossing the road, or something more tangible, something real. But there was nothing. Just the fog, swirling, thickening, until it felt like the entire world had shrunk down to just me and this bridge. The night stretched on. It felt colder now. My breath came out in visible puffs. My hands were clammy, and my heart was beating faster than it should. Another scraping. Louder this time. I snapped my head to the side, searching the edges of the bridge. The shadows seemed to move, flickering just out of the corner of my eye. And then I saw it. A figure. A dark shape, standing at the far end of the bridge, just out of the reach of the headlights. I couldn't make out any details, just a vague outline of a person. No, not a person, something too tall, too wide. My pulse raced. I should have turned around. I should have driven back, found another route home. But there was something about that shape. Something magnetic. I couldn't look away. I wanted to shout, to call out to it, but my mouth went dry. I didn't know what I expected to happen, but I kept moving forward. It was like the bridge had me in its grip now. Closer. The shape was closer. The scraping noise grew louder, sharper, as if whatever was out there was moving toward me, dragging something along the road. My eyes were glued to the figure now. It was human in form, but wrong. Its body shifted, bent unnaturally, like the bridge itself was changing it. I slammed on the brakes. The car jerked to a stop. The shape moved closer, and I could see it clearly now. Its face was nothing but a blur, a swirl of blackness. Its arms stretched too long, fingers too thin, like branches bending in the wind. The air around me felt thick, heavy with a pressure that made it hard to breathe. I could hear my heart thudding in my ears, but it was drowned out by a voice that wasn't mine. It came from everywhere, inside me, around me. Leave or die. It wasn't words, not exactly. It was a feeling, a force. I stepped on the gas, the car lurching forward, desperate to break free. But the road wasn't clear. It twisted, stretched. The bridge was changing. The asphalt seemed to ripple under my tires, and the lights flickered, their glow dimming. Something was pulling me back. I don't know what happened next. One moment, I was speeding toward the end of the bridge, my heart pounding, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. And the next, everything blurred. The fog wrapped around the car, thick and heavy, like it was suffocating me. I couldn't see a thing, just the dim glow of the headlights casting eerie shadows against the gray mist. I hit the brakes again, heart racing, but the car didn't stop. It kept sliding, moving forward, no matter how hard I pressed. The wheels screamed, the sound of the tires against the wet road echoing in my ears, but it felt like I was trapped in a nightmare where nothing worked as it should. I glanced around. The figure was gone, but I could still feel its presence, something watching me from the shadows, from the corners of my vision. The feeling was worse now, like I was no longer alone in the car. Like something was right beside me, breathing with me, its gaze burning into my skin. I forced my eyes back to the road, gripping the wheels so tightly my knuckles went white. The city lights I had seen just moments ago were now gone. There was nothing but the fog, swallowing everything. Just get through it, I whispered to myself. I had to get out of here. I couldn't stay on this bridge. I needed to survive. But the fog kept growing thicker. It wasn't just mist, it felt alive. It wasn't natural. It pressed against the car, curling around the windows, creeping in from the sides. It felt like it was trying to pull me into the void, to take me somewhere I didn't want to go. I could hear something now. A low hum. It wasn't the sound of the car engine. It was a strange, vibrating noise, as though the very bridge itself was vibrating, resonating with some unseen force. The sound grew louder, closer, and with it came that scraping noise again. It was louder now, frantic, as if something, or someone, was dragging itself across the road, coming closer. "Please, God, just let me off this bridge," I muttered. The bridge stretched endlessly, and no matter how far I drove, it never seemed to end. The road twisted, the curve ahead becoming steeper, sharper. The car started to buck, like it was losing control, like the road itself was fighting me, trying to throw me off. I slammed the wheel to the side, desperate to keep the car steady, but something gave way. The front tire hit something hard. A thud. Then the back tire. Another thud. I couldn't breathe. The car jolted. And then, with a terrible screech, it stopped. I glanced around frantically, my pulse thundering in my ears. The fog was so thick now that I could barely see the front of the car. The lights were useless. Everything was swallowed by the mist. Suddenly, I heard something else, footsteps. Slow, deliberate. And the scraping sound. Closer now. I didn't know what it was. I didn't want to know. I grabbed the door handle and yanked, throwing myself out of the car. My feet hit the concrete, and I stumbled forward, the air cold and wet, the fog like a heavy cloak over everything. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it. That presence, following me. My legs were shaky, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I ran. I didn't know where I was running to, but I had to get away. The bridge seemed endless, like it stretched on forever. The ground underfoot felt uneven, shifting, as if the bridge was changing, moving with me. I glanced over my shoulder, unable to resist. The car was gone. There was no sign of it, as though it had never been there. But that scraping sound continued. The footsteps. They were behind me now, closing in. I heard a voice then. It wasn't a human voice. It wasn't even a whisper. It was a low, guttural sound, like the bridge itself was speaking, the words unrecognizable, but filled with an ancient fury. Leave. The word was sharp, commanding, and I felt it deep in my chest, like a shock wave, vibrating my bones. I froze, caught in the grip of that voice, unable to move. Then I heard something else, laughter. Cold, mocking, distant. And then the figure. It appeared again, just ahead, standing in the center of the bridge. The same shape, the same grotesque form, its long arms stretching out toward me. I didn't know how much time had passed, but when I looked up, the bridge had changed. It was no longer the familiar stretch of concrete I knew. The road ahead was cracked, decayed, covered in a strange moss-like substance. The air was thick with the smell of rot, and the hum of the bridge had grown louder, vibrating underfoot. The fog wasn't just fog anymore. It was alive, swirling around me like it had a mind of its own. And that figure, it was still there. Watching. Waiting. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. I had to get off the bridge. I had to. Suddenly, I heard the sound of a car engine. A faint noise, barely audible over the chaos around me, but it was real. I turned toward it, my heart skipping a beat. Someone else had to be on the bridge, right? Maybe they could help me. Maybe I wasn't alone. But as I strained to listen, the sound of the engine became distorted. The hum grew louder, the scraping sound mixing with it, until it was unbearable, a cacophony of mechanical noise, distorted voices, and that relentless scraping. I couldn't breathe. The bridge felt like it was closing in on me. The air was thick with pressure, squeezing tighter with every passing second. The figure was closer now, its shape growing more defined, its face still a blur of blackness, but there was something else. A smile, or something that resembled it. And then, the world went dark. I don't remember what happened next. One moment, I was standing in the middle of the bridge, trying to catch my breath, and the next, it was like I was trapped in a dream, or maybe something worse. The fog was thick, but it wasn't just fog anymore, it was suffocating, a tangible force pressing in on me, pressing in on my chest, on my mind. I couldn't think. I couldn't see. The sound of the engine was gone. The laughter was gone. The scraping was gone. Everything was still, but not in a way that comforted me. It was a silence that felt wrong, like something was waiting, something unseen, something that didn't belong. The only thing I could hear now was my own heartbeat, thudding in my ears like it was trying to escape my chest. I stumbled forward, my legs like jelly, and I tried to make sense of the darkness around me. The world felt distorted, as though it was bending and warping around me. The bridge was no longer just a bridge. It was something else entirely, a place outside of time and space, a place that shouldn't exist. Then, I saw it. The figure. Standing just ahead, waiting for me. It was still blurred, just like before, but now it wasn't just a shadow. It was more. I could feel its presence, cold and powerful, like it was consuming everything around it. The figure took a step toward me, its movements unnatural, jerky, as if it wasn't even human. The laughter started again, low and distorted, echoing in my ears, but I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It was all around me. I tried to move, to run, but my feet wouldn't obey. It was like the bridge itself was holding me in place, trapping me. I couldn't escape. "Please," I whispered, my voice hoarse, barely a breath. "Let me go." But the figure didn't respond. It just stood there, waiting, watching. It raised one of its long, distorted arms, pointing directly at me. I could feel the weight of its gaze, pressing down on me, suffocating me. I felt like I was being pulled toward it, like I was being drawn into its darkness, and I couldn't stop it. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was trapped in the fog, trapped in the bridge, with no way to escape. And then, everything shifted. The air turned cold, so cold that I could see my breath, swirling in the air before me, like it was being pulled into something. The fog parted slightly, just enough for me to see the edges of the bridge, the railings that had once been familiar now twisted and warped, as if they were stretching into nothingness. I could feel the bridge beneath my feet trembling, like it was alive, like it was shifting, changing. It was no longer a bridge. It was a gate. A portal. I didn't know how, but I knew this was the moment. The moment when everything would change. The moment when the bridge would take me, or let me go. There was no escaping it now. I looked at the figure again, its face still obscured, but now there was something else, something worse. It was grinning. The darkness that surrounded it began to move, swirling around it like smoke, like a living thing. It reached out toward me. The world spun. The ground beneath my feet shifted. I felt myself being pulled, dragged toward it. I could feel the coldness of its presence wrapping around me, the weight of its stare pressing into my skin. My heart raced, my breath quickened, but I couldn't stop myself. I couldn't move. And then everything went dark. I woke up on the ground. My face was pressed against something cold and hard. It took me a moment to gather my thoughts. The air was thick with the scent of rust and dampness, and I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing against me. The fog had cleared, but the atmosphere felt heavier than before, like the world itself had been altered in some way I couldn't understand. I pushed myself up, my hands trembling as I touched the rough surface beneath me. The bridge was still there, but it was different. It was darker. The once familiar structure now seemed ancient, its metal railings twisted and gnarled like the bones of some long-forgotten creature. I could hear faint scraping sounds from somewhere in the distance, distant echoes that sent shivers down my spine. I stumbled to my feet, disoriented and terrified. My heart was racing, thudding in my chest as I looked around, trying to make sense of my surroundings. Everything felt wrong. The world didn't look the way it should. The bridge seemed to stretch on forever in both directions, yet it was impossibly narrow. The misty air had an oppressive weight to it, almost as though it were trying to swallow me whole. And then I heard it. A whisper. "Don't turn around." The voice was soft, yet it cut through the silence with a chilling clarity. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't anyone else's I recognized. It was a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It was deep, hollow, as if it had been waiting here for a very long time. I froze. I had been in many dangerous situations in my life, but nothing had ever felt quite like this. It was like the bridge was alive, like it was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath. "Who's there?" My voice cracked, betraying my fear. But there was no response. The whisper had gone, leaving behind a suffocating silence. My eyes darted around, but there was nothing, only the endless stretch of the bridge and the fog rolling in again, thicker now than before. I took a hesitant step forward, my legs unsteady. There had to be a way off this cursed bridge. I couldn't stay here. I needed to leave. But something told me that the bridge wasn't going to let me go that easily. I forced myself to move, one step at a time. Every step I took felt like it was being watched. Every footfall seemed to echo louder than it should have, reverberating in the silence. And then I heard it again. The scraping sound. Closer this time. It wasn't just a noise, it was something moving. Something alive. I froze again, my eyes wide. I turned slowly, heart pounding in my chest, praying it was just the wind or some trick of the mind. But it wasn't. Standing just behind me was a figure, a shadow in the mist. A tall, dark shape that seemed to sway with the fog, blending into it. It didn't have a face, not really. Just a void where its features should have been, empty, dark, like it was nothing at all. The edges of its form seemed to ripple, like smoke. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. All I could do was stare at it. It raised one long arm, fingers twisting unnaturally, pointing at me. There was no sound, no warning. The only thing I felt was a deep, oppressive pressure in my chest. It was as if the very air around me was suffocating me, pushing down on my lungs. Leave, the voice whispered again, but now it wasn't just a whisper. It was a command, cold and final. Leave, or stay forever. The figure started to move toward me, its movements jerky, unnatural. It wasn't walking, more like it was floating, hovering just above the ground. I could feel its presence closing in on me, surrounding me with an unholy weight. I tried to run. I turned and bolted toward the other end of the bridge, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my feet stumbling over the warped surface of the path. But the more I ran, the longer the bridge seemed to stretch. The end of the bridge was always just out of reach. I kept running, my body aching, my mind screaming at me to get away, to escape. But the darkness was closing in, and no matter how fast I moved, it was always there, right behind me. I didn't know how much longer I could keep going. My legs were giving out, my strength fading. I could hear the sound of something following me, something fast, something relentless. And then I saw it. A door at the far end of the bridge. It was a simple wooden door, standing alone in the darkness, framed by nothing. A doorway to nowhere. I didn't think. I didn't question it. I ran toward it. The door creaked open as I approached, just as if it had been waiting for me. The moment I stepped through, the sound stopped. The fog dissipated. The pressure on my chest lifted. I was outside. I was free. But when I turned to look back, the bridge was gone. There was nothing but darkness. The bridge had vanished, as if it had never existed at all. And yet, as I stood there, alone in the night, I felt its presence still lingering, heavy in the air. I stood there in the cold, looking at the empty space where the bridge had once been. The only sounds I could hear were the distant hum of the city and the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. The darkness felt oppressive, as though it had somehow followed me through the door and into the real world. I should have felt relief. I had escaped, hadn't I? I had crossed the cursed bridge and emerged on the other side. Yet, deep down, something told me that this wasn't over. The bridge wasn't gone. It wasn't gone for good. I turned around, scanning my surroundings. The door I had passed through still stood, but it had faded into the night. It was just a memory now, an impossible door that had led me away from something I couldn't fully comprehend. But then I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I whipped around, my heart pounding in my chest. But there was no one there. Nothing but the cold air and the shadows. Still, the feeling didn't leave me. I wasn't alone. The wind picked up, carrying with it an eerie, distant sound. It was soft at first, almost like a whisper, but it grew louder as it approached. My breath caught in my throat. It was the sound of something scraping, like metal on stone, and the distinct feeling of something coming closer. I backed up, instinctively, my eyes scanning the street. I had to get away. I had to leave before it caught up with me. But there was no place to hide. The street was empty, stretching into the dark horizon with no sign of life. Then I saw it, a figure, standing at the far end of the street. It was tall, shadowy, and indistinct, but I could feel its gaze on me. My blood ran cold. The figure had no face. Just a void of darkness, the same darkness I had felt on the bridge. It raised one arm, pointing directly at me. Leave, the voice echoed again, but now it was sharper, more insistent, as though it were in order. You belong to it now. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my legs were frozen in place. The figure began to move toward me, its motions jerky, like it was shifting between dimensions, flickering in and out of reality. With every step it took, the sound of metal scraping against stone grew louder. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to respond. The figure closed in, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I hadn't escaped at all. The bridge hadn't let me go. It had followed me. It had been waiting for me to return. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet shifted. The pavement cracked, and a dark, thick fog began to spill out of the cracks, swallowing the street in an instant. I could see nothing but the swirling, inky blackness, and the feeling of being trapped in a nightmare became all-consuming. I tried to scream, but my voice was lost in the fog. The figure was still there, now just a silhouette in the mist, its arms still outstretched toward me. I could feel its presence pressing in on me, suffocating me. It was like being trapped in a dream, where every move I made only pulled me deeper into the nightmare. And then I heard something else, a faint, familiar sound. The scraping noise. It wasn't just the figure anymore. It was everywhere, coming from all directions. The bridge, I realized, was calling to me again. It had never let me go. It was here, in the very air I breathed, in the fog, in the shadows. Not this way, I whispered to myself, my heart pounding. I can't go back. But the fog thickened, and the sounds grew louder. The figure stepped forward, its dark form reaching out to touch me. I could feel the cold, empty air brushing against my skin, and I realized, too late, that I was trapped once more. In the distance, I thought I saw something faint, something almost familiar. The faint outline of a bridge, its dark shape barely visible in the distance. The black bridge had returned. And this time, there would be no escape. Frost in the heart. It was early December when I first noticed the strange tracks. The snow had fallen heavy the night before, coating everything in a thick, white blanket. The kind of snow that makes the world feel silent, like it's holding its breath. It was the kind of morning where you'd expect to hear the usual bustle of cars and people moving about, but instead, the air felt still, thick with anticipation. I was out for my usual walk in the woods near my cabin. Living alone in the forests of Maine had its benefits. The isolation, the quiet, the peace, it was exactly what I needed after a messy divorce and a life that had felt like it was spiraling out of control. But this morning was different. There was an unnatural chill in the air, something beyond the usual cold of winter. A sense of foreboding, though I couldn't yet explain why. As I trudged through the snow, my boots crunching with each step, I saw them. Footsteps. Frozen, clear as day, but wrong. They weren't human, not exactly. Too large, too spread out, as though something far heavier had passed through the snow. They led deep into the forest, winding between the trees as though the creature that had made them had been following some unseen path. I froze for a moment, unsure of what to make of it. My breath came out in sharp clouds, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. No one lived this far out, at least, no one who would have left such tracks. I hadn't heard of any animals large enough to make them either. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing through all sorts of wild possibilities. Perhaps it was some sort of trick of the light, or an illusion caused by the way the snow had settled. But no! These tracks were real, and they were fresh. I turned and looked back at the safety of my cabin, its faint outline barely visible through the mist rising from the trees. My first instinct was to turn around and head back inside. but something kept me rooted to the spot. Curiosity? Foolishness? Maybe both. I took one last glance over my shoulder and began to follow the footsteps. The forest was eerily quiet as I ventured deeper, the trees towering above me like silent sentinels. The only sounds were my boots in the snow and the occasional rustle of the wind through the branches. I tried to push away the sense of unease creeping up my spine, but it was hard to ignore. There was something wrong about the way the forest felt now. The trees seemed to loom closer, their twisted branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The air felt colder, biting through my jacket with an intensity that didn't seem natural for this time of year. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the isolation starting to get to me. After all, it wasn't the first time I'd let my thoughts wander too far. But even as I tried to convince myself, the sense of dread grew. The footsteps led me deeper into the woods, each step more deliberate than the last. Then, as I neared a small clearing, I saw it. The forest floor was frozen solid, and there, in the center of the clearing, was a patch of snow that was untouched, perfectly still, like a blank canvas. But there was something off about it. Something not quite right. The air around it shimmered faintly, like heat rising off the ground on a summer day, but this was winter, and there was no warmth in sight. And then I heard it, the faintest whisper, a voice that was not my own, drifting through the trees. Leave. I spun around, but there was no one there. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I had to be imagining it. There was no other explanation. I took a step back, and then another, trying to calm myself. The voice came again, louder this time. Leave, now. My legs were frozen in place. Something told me that if I stayed any longer, I would never leave at all. The footsteps, the cold, the voice, there was something in these woods that wasn't supposed to be there. Something that didn't want me to leave. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, carrying with it an unnatural chill that seemed to seep into my bones. I turned and began to walk quickly, trying to retrace my steps back to the cabin. But the moment I did, the world around me seemed to shift. The clearing wasn't where it should have been anymore. The trees loomed even closer, their twisted branches forming a canopy overhead that blotted out the sky. The path was gone, replaced by a thick fog that hung low to the ground, curling around my ankles like a living thing. And then, before I could take another step, the footsteps returned. Frozen in place, I dared not move, the terror in my chest threatening to crush me. Leave, the voice said again, but this time it was closer. Much closer. And just as I thought I might faint from fear, I saw them. Figures. Shadows. Moving slowly, deliberately, like creatures from a dream. The figures stepped out of the fog, and for a moment, I thought they were human. But they weren't. The shapes were too fluid, too unnatural. They flickered in and out of existence, like shadows stretching across the snow. And then one of them reached out toward me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And I realized, in that moment, that these weren't just shadows. They were souls, trapped in this place, frozen in time. And soon, I would join them. My heart raced, the panic setting in like ice freezing over my veins. The figures in the fog moved closer, their ghostly shapes becoming more distinct. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. I could feel my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps, the frozen air seeping into my lungs. Each figure moved with an eerie grace, as if they were weightless, shifting through the fog like mist itself. One of them stepped forward, its form becoming clearer with each passing second. It had no face, just an empty void where eyes should have been, and its body was a dark, translucent blur, its limbs stretching in unnatural angles. I wanted to turn and run, but my feet felt as though they were glued to the frozen ground, paralyzed by the presence of whatever these beings were. Leave now. The voice came again, but this time it was not just in my ears, it was in my mind, pressing against my skull like a cold wind. The words were not just a warning, they felt like a command, a desperate plea from something far older and more powerful than anything I could comprehend. But I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. The figure in front of me extended its hand, its fingers twisting and elongating, reaching toward me with unnatural speed. A sharp, cold wind whipped through the clearing, and for a moment I thought I saw something glimmer in the fog, another shape, another figure, watching from a distance. I took a step back, my boots crunching loudly in the snow, breaking the silence. But the sound was wrong, distorted, as if it had been muffled by something unseen. The figure didn't stop. It kept coming. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet shifted. A low rumble, like the sound of ice cracking beneath a heavy weight, echoed through the forest. The trees around me groaned, their branches creaking and bending as if they too were aware of the danger closing in. The air grew colder, impossibly colder, and I could see my breath swirling in front of me like fog. I turned sharply, my instincts screaming at me to run, to get as far away as possible. But the clearing had shifted again, the path that had once led me back to safety no longer there. The fog had thickened, and the trees had closed in, their black silhouettes towering over me like sentinels. I was trapped. Leave, the voice repeated, louder this time, vibrating through my chest. It was no longer just a whisper, but a deep, guttural sound that seemed to come from the very ground beneath my feet. I stumbled backward, feeling the weight of something heavy in the air, like the pressure before a storm. My mind raced. There had to be an explanation. It couldn't be real. This was just some trick, some twisted figment of my imagination brought on by too much isolation, too much time alone in these woods. But deep down, I knew it was real. I could feel it in the cold that wrapped around my body, in the way the trees seemed to lean in closer, watching, waiting. The figure in front of me stopped. It was just a few feet away now, its presence suffocating. I could feel its cold, its emptiness, pressing against me, filling the space between us. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The figure vanished, melting into the fog, leaving behind only the chill in the air and the silence of the forest. I stood there, frozen in place, my mind scrambling to make sense of what had just happened. The figures, the voice, the feeling of being trapped. What was this place? Why did it feel like it had swallowed me whole, like I was never meant to leave? I didn't know how much time passed before I could move again. My legs were stiff, my body trembling from both the cold and the fear that had taken root in my chest. Slowly, cautiously, I turned in every direction, trying to find a way out. But the trees seemed to stretch further and further into the fog, their branches twisting into shapes that no longer resembled anything I recognized. It was as though the forest itself had transformed into something alive. Then, through the fog, I saw it. A shadowy figure standing at the edge of the trees. At first, it was just a shape, indistinct and blurred, but as I squinted, trying to make out its form, I realized it was another person. A man. His face was hidden beneath the hood of a dark cloak, and his body was unnaturally still, almost as if he was a part of the forest itself. He stood motionless, watching me with what I could only describe as an unreadable gaze. I wanted to call out to him, to ask if he could help me find my way back, but the words wouldn't come. It was as though the air around him had sucked all the sound from my throat, leaving me mute. The man's hand raised slowly, pointing toward the heart of the forest. "Don't," he said, his voice barely a whisper, but it was clear. "You're not meant to leave." His words echoed in my mind long after he had disappeared into the fog. The fog had thickened even more, curling like tendrils around my body, making it harder to breathe, harder to see. The trees loomed overhead, their skeletal branches reaching out like hands trying to grasp at me. The man's warning echoed in my mind, growing louder with each passing moment, drowning out any attempt at rational thought. "Don't. You're not meant to leave." I wasn't sure if I was meant to escape. Was it some kind of curse? A trap? My thoughts circled like a vortex, dragging me deeper into confusion. I was no longer in control, no longer sure of anything except one horrifying truth: I was not alone in these woods. I pressed on, my steps sluggish and hesitant. The cold had seeped into my bones, each breath feeling like ice forming in my chest. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, or someone, following me. But there was nothing. Only the oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional crack of a branch in the distance. I should have turned back. I should have found my way home, back to the safety of the warmth, back to the familiarity of my town. But the trees kept pushing me forward. The deeper I went, the more I felt like the forest itself was alive, breathing around me, shifting its weight, waiting for something. I stumbled forward, the ground beneath my feet becoming uneven, treacherous. My feet sunk into the thick snow with each step, and the crunching sound reverberated through the forest like a warning bell. I stopped, trying to listen for any sign of life, any sound other than the echo of my own fear. Then I heard it. A distant sound, faint but unmistakable. It started as a whisper, then grew into a low hum, like a voice calling from far off. But it wasn't just one voice. It was multiple, layered together, murmuring in languages I didn't recognize. The words were incomprehensible, but the tone was not just foreign, it was ancient. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The forest around me seemed to hold its breath, and the ground felt like it was moving beneath me, shifting, almost as if it were alive. The voices, were they real? Or was my mind simply unraveling from the isolation, from the cold? The humming grew louder, and with it, the trees began to move. No, not move, shift. The trunks warped and twisted, bending unnaturally, as though the forest itself were shifting to some rhythm, like a living organism adjusting its shape. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed for me to turn and flee, but my feet felt frozen in place. The voices grew louder still, until they were so close that I could almost feel them vibrating through the air, rattling my bones. And then, just as suddenly, they stopped. Silence. Total, suffocating silence. The fog parted for a brief moment, and through the shifting mist, I saw something, a shadow, barely distinguishable at first, but then it became clear. A figure, standing motionless in front of me, bathed in an eerie glow. It was a woman. Her face was pale, almost ethereal, and her long hair floated around her as though caught in a wind that only she could feel. She was not real. I knew it in my gut. This was no living person. This was something else. "Why have you come?" Her voice was soft, a whisper that seemed to swirl in the air around me. "You should not have come." I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. The fear that had gripped me since I first entered the forest now turned into something darker, more suffocating. My mind screamed for answers, but my body refused to move. I was frozen, rooted to the spot by the weight of her presence. Her gaze was piercing, her eyes black as night, like two bottomless pits that swallowed the light. I could feel her stare digging into me, pulling at my very soul. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I couldn't tear my eyes from hers. "Do you know what happens to those who enter this place?" she asked, her voice like ice scraping against glass. "Do you understand the price you will pay?" I swallowed hard, trying to find my voice, but it felt impossible. The air was thick, choking me, pressing against my chest. "You'll never leave," she continued, her words slow, deliberate. "Not in the way you think. You'll wander forever, lost, a part of this place. The forest takes those who walk too far into its heart. It claims their souls." Her hand reached out toward me, and I could feel a cold, unnatural wind swirling around her fingers. It was as though the very air had become alive, pulling me closer, drawing me toward her. My heart hammered in my chest, my instinct screaming for me to fight, to run. But I was paralyzed. She smiled, but it wasn't a smile. It was something far darker, more knowing. "You can't leave," she whispered, as though the words were meant to settle into my very soul. And then, the world seemed to warp. The trees bent impossibly close, their twisted forms closing in around me. The fog thickened, the whispers returned, louder now, chaotic, suffocating. The ground beneath my feet seemed to tremble as if something ancient and powerful was waking, stirring deep below the earth. The woman's face grew sharper, her features becoming more defined, more menacing. Her smile stretched wider, her teeth jagged and sharp, like those of a predator. The cold wind around her intensified, biting into my skin, freezing me to the core. "You should have never come," she repeated, her voice rising in intensity, echoing through the forest, through the very air itself. And then everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. Time in that forest doesn't follow the rules, it doesn't move the way it should. Everything feels suspended in the cold, in that never-ending twilight where the sun never seems to rise or set. My body felt numb, stiff, like I was frozen from the inside out. My chest burned with each breath, and every part of me felt distant, as though I was detached from myself. When I awoke, I was lying on the cold ground, my head pounding, my limbs heavy. I struggled to sit up, fighting against the weight of exhaustion pressing on me. The forest around me was eerily still, no more whispering voices, no more shifting trees. It was as if everything had returned to its unnatural calm, but I knew better. I could still feel her presence lingering, that strange coldness in the air that wasn't from the weather, but from something far deeper, far darker. I pushed myself up, using the nearest tree for support. My hands shook as I touched the rough bark, trying to steady myself. I felt different. Not just physically drained, but spiritually, like a part of me had been torn away, a part of me that I couldn't name. I glanced around, trying to make sense of my surroundings. The forest looked exactly the same as it had when I entered, but now it felt different. It was no longer just a forest, it felt like a place outside of time, a place where the rules didn't apply. I could still hear the soft crunch of snow beneath my boots, but it felt muffled, distant, as if the sound came from somewhere else entirely. Then, I noticed it, something had changed in the landscape. The frozen footprints were gone. The marks in the snow that had led me here had vanished, as though they had never existed. I was lost. Completely lost. I turned in every direction, trying to find a sign of where I had come from, but the forest was endless, stretching out in all directions, all alike, all identical. I couldn't even remember the path I'd taken. Every tree, every shadow seemed unfamiliar now, even though I had walked through them only moments before. It was as if the forest had erased all traces of my journey, as if it didn't want me to leave. I stumbled forward, moving faster now, driven by a desperate need to escape. But no matter how much I walked, no matter how many trees I passed, the landscape remained unchanged. I wasn't making progress. I was just walking in circles. My panic began to grow. The fog had thickened again, creeping up from the ground like a living thing, wrapping around me, suffocating me. I could feel the cold creeping back into my chest, squeezing my heart. The forest was playing tricks on me, pulling me deeper into its web. I wasn't just lost in the woods, I was lost in time itself. And then I heard it again, the whispering. It started softly, like a breeze brushing against my ears. But this time, it wasn't just the soft murmuring of distant voices. No, this time, the voices were closer. They were speaking to me. Speaking my name. Ethan, it was a soft, pleading voice, full of sorrow. Ethan, come closer. I froze, every muscle in my body locking in place. The voice sounded so familiar. It sounded like my mother, like my sister. But it wasn't them. I knew it wasn't them. It couldn't be. I took a step back, my heart pounding harder now, my body drenched in sweat despite the cold. The voice called again, closer now, more insistent. Ethan, please, we've been waiting for you. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my body refused to obey. It was as if something invisible was holding me in place, forcing me to listen, to move closer. Against my better judgment, I stepped forward, the snow crunching beneath my boots. The fog parted just enough to reveal a figure in the distance, standing beneath a tree. The figure was small, hunched, and draped in dark robes. The face was hidden, but I could feel its gaze on me, piercing through the veil of fog. Come closer, the voice beckoned again. You were meant to be with us now. I couldn't help myself. My feet moved of their own accord, drawn to the figure as if some invisible force was pulling me in. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees bending toward me as I walked, watching my every move. When I was close enough, the figure finally spoke. You should have never entered the forest, Ethan. I froze. The voice wasn't the same anymore. It was darker, colder, like 1,000 voices whispering in unison, each one full of malice. The figure lifted its hood, revealing a face that was not human. It was a mask of frozen skin, twisted in agony, with eyes that glowed an unnatural shade of white. The creature's grin was stretched wide, its teeth sharp and jagged. You are ours now, it said, and before I could react, its hand shot out, grabbing me by the shoulders. A coldness seeped into my skin, spreading through my veins, freezing my very soul. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. The cold was unbearable, and the world around me began to fade, the trees and fog dissolving into nothingness. All I could feel was the freezing grip tightening around me, pulling me deeper into the forest, into the heart of the darkness. And in that moment, I understood. The forest didn't just trap you in its maze, it consumed you. It took your soul, leaving nothing behind but a frozen shell, lost forever in its depths. I don't know how long I was trapped in the creature's grasp. Time had no meaning anymore. The cold that enveloped me wasn't just from the snow or the air. It was a deep, suffocating cold that seemed to come from within, as though it was freezing my very essence, my memories, my will. Every second felt like an eternity, every breath a struggle against the freezing numbness that was slowly taking over my body. I wanted to scream, to fight, to escape, but I couldn't. My body felt like stone, unresponsive, as though it had been drained of all vitality. My legs buckled beneath me, and I collapsed onto the icy ground, unable to move. The creature above me laughed, its voice a hollow echo that seemed to vibrate through the very earth beneath me. "You will stay here," it whispered. "Forever." But I couldn't give up. I couldn't let it end like this. Somewhere, deep inside me, a flicker of resistance remained, though it was faint, barely a whisper against the overwhelming cold. I knew I had to fight, to survive, even if it meant something I didn't understand. I had to find a way out before the forest claimed me completely. I clenched my fists, forcing my numb fingers to move, to grasp at the snow beneath me. My breath came in short gasps, and the icy air burned my lungs, but I refused to let it consume me. With every ounce of strength, I pulled myself to my feet. I had no idea where I was going, no sense of direction anymore, but I had to move. I had to escape. The trees around me creaked, their branches groaning under the weight of the frost that seemed to thicken in the air. The forest was alive, but not in any way I understood. It was as if the very ground beneath my feet was watching, waiting. The frozen whispers still lingered in my ears, the voices of those who had come before me, lost to the same curse. But their voices had no pity, they only sought to pull me deeper into their endless void. I stumbled forward, the world spinning around me. The snow beneath my boots crackled, and I looked up to see that the trees were moving, shifting, as though they were closing in on me. Every direction seemed the same, a labyrinth of light and shadow, each step taking me further into the heart of the forest. The cold was unbearable. My skin felt like it was freezing over, turning to ice, and my breath turned to mist in front of me, swirling in the frosty air. But something in me refused to let go of hope. I had to find it, the source of the curse, the heart of the forest that had trapped me in its eternal winter. And then I saw it. In the distance, through the thick fog and the white haze, there was a figure. A shape, standing tall, unmoving, like a shadow against the snowy backdrop. The figure was tall and cloaked in a dark, flowing garment that seemed to absorb the light around it, making it impossible to see its face. But I knew, somehow, that this was the heart of the forest, the source of everything, the center of its power. I felt an urge to move toward it, to approach this figure, this being that held the answers to everything. It was the key to the curse. I was certain of it. If I could reach it, I could free myself, and maybe even those who had come before me, their souls trapped in this endless cold. I forced my legs to move, each step a battle against the frozen numbness that seemed to slow me down. The figure loomed closer, its outline growing sharper in the mist. But as I neared it, something strange began to happen. The ground beneath my feet grew softer, the snow more treacherous. It felt like the earth was trying to swallow me, dragging me down into its depths. My heart raced, and my mind screamed for me to stop, to turn back. But I couldn't. I was too close now. I reached out with trembling hands, and as I touched the figure's cloak, a sharp chill ran through my body, coursing through my veins like liquid ice. The air around me crackled, and I heard the whisper again, closer, clearer this time. "You should have never come." The voice was cold, ancient, and filled with regret. It wasn't the creature anymore, it was something else, something older, something that had been here long before me. Suddenly, the figure turned, and I saw its face. No, not a face, but a mask of ice, frozen and cracked, as if it had once been human but had been consumed by the forest's curse. Its eyes glowed with a strange, unnatural light, and for a moment I thought I saw the faces of the lost souls trapped inside it, their eyes pleading, begging for release. Before I could react, the mask of ice cracked open, and the figure stepped forward, its icy hand reaching out to grasp my wrist. And then everything went black. I woke up to the sound of birds chirping. Warmth bathed my face, the sunlight felt real again. I was back in the world I knew. But when I looked down at my hands, I saw the ice, thick and frozen, covering my skin like a second layer. The frost was still there, clinging to me, and my breath was shallow. The forest hadn't released me. I was still trapped. The last thought I had before everything faded away was a chilling one. I would never leave the forest. It would claim me, like it had claimed them all. Shadow without body. The town of Millbrook, Wisconsin, was small, quiet. Nestled between forests and rolling hills, it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. It was peaceful. Too peaceful. But sometimes, peace can be deceiving. I had lived in Millbrook all my life. I had never felt the need to leave. But lately, things had changed. It started with the whispers. At first, they were subtle, people talking behind their hands, casting furtive glances at the evening sky. Then, the stories began circulating. Stories about strange occurrences that nobody wanted to admit, but everyone felt. It was always at night. It wasn't the kind of thing that could be seen, but it could be felt. A presence, something watching from the dark corners of your vision. A shiver crawling up your spine without reason. Shadows that moved, but weren't quite shadows at all. I had heard about it from my friend, Emily. She was one of those people who liked to pretend she wasn't afraid of anything. But there was fear in her voice the night she told me about the figures. People, shapes, moving through the streets when no one was around. They weren't human. They didn't have faces, bodies, or even substance. Just shapes in the dark that slid silently along the walls. At first, I dismissed it. Ghost stories, I thought. Just the imagination running wild, a product of too many late nights and too much alcohol. But as the days passed, the stories kept coming. People began disappearing. Little by little. First, the old man who lived down the road, then the young couple from the next block. No one saw them leave, no one heard anything. But the worst part was the town's silence. No one was talking about it. Everyone just went about their business, pretending nothing had changed. As if they ignored it, it would go away. I couldn't ignore it. One night, after hearing about another strange disappearance, I decided to go out. I needed to know if these things were real or if my mind had simply started playing tricks on me. The night was cold, colder than usual, and the wind was sharp against my skin. I bundled up, pulled my head tight, and stepped outside. The streetlights flickered as I walked, casting long, crooked shadows across the road. The silence was unnerving. The kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched. I reached the edge of town, the last row of houses before the woods. That was where Emily had seen it. That was where she said the figures appeared. There was something about the forest at night. The trees seemed to shift in the wind, bending toward the road as if they were waiting for something. I stood at the edge, my breath forming little clouds in the air. The woods stretched out in front of me, dark and still. Too still. I looked around, half expecting to see someone else standing there, but the road was empty. The town felt miles away. Then, I saw it. A figure. I froze. At first, it was just a blur, a distortion in the shadows. But it didn't belong there. It was too empty. No form, no depth. Just a shifting void, like a part of the night had broken free and was now moving on its own. I took a step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, but I felt it. I felt it looking at me. Suddenly, there was a sound, a faint rustling behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. The air was still. No wind. Just the weight of the silence pressing in around me. My breath caught in my throat. Something wasn't right. The hairs on my neck stood up, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger, more intense. I took a step back, but the figure didn't move. It just was. And then it started moving. Not walking, not running, just gliding, slipping through the trees with a kind of fluid motion that made my stomach twist. I took a few more steps backward, my pulse racing. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. But I didn't. Something held me in place. The air felt thick, like I was trapped in a dream where I couldn't move or scream. The figure, if it even was a figure, moved closer, its presence overwhelming, its shape undulating as if it was trying to become something, anything. It didn't have a face, a body. It wasn't human. I could feel the coldness of it, an unnatural coldness that seeped into my bones. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. My body refused to obey, my eyes locked onto that shifting mass of nothingness. A whisper. A low, growling whisper, crawling into my ears, seeping into my thoughts. It's time. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know if it was talking to me or if it was something else entirely. But I understood one thing. Whatever it wasn't going to let me leave. The cold grew deeper, spreading through my chest, my arms, my legs. My thoughts started to blur. I needed to run. I knew I needed to run, but my feet felt like they were stuck in the ground. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. It lingered in front of me, silent, its presence suffocating. The whisper faded, leaving only the cold, the eerie silence, and the feeling that something was still watching me. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't explain any of it. But as I turned and stumbled away, I knew one thing for sure. Millbrook wasn't just haunted by ghosts. It was being hunted. And I was next. The next day, I told myself I was being foolish. That what I'd seen, or thought I saw, was just a trick of the mind. Maybe the shadows had played with my eyes, or perhaps my mind had twisted the sounds of the wind into something more terrifying than they were. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. It had felt too real. The cold had sunk into my bones, and the whisper. I couldn't shake it. It replayed over and over in my head, the words echoing in my thoughts. It's time. Time for what? The fear gnawed at me. I couldn't focus on anything. The faces of the people in town, the same ones who'd been whispering and avoiding each other, all blurred together into a single image. Everyone was on edge, as if they knew something terrible was coming. I couldn't stop thinking about Emily. She'd always been the strong one, the level-headed one. She never spoke of fear, at least not openly. But now, I wondered if something had happened to her, something she wasn't telling me. It had been days since I'd last seen her. Normally, we'd meet for coffee or just walk around town, but she'd been avoiding me. I hadn't gotten a response to my messages. I needed to know if she had seen it too, if she had felt the same pull toward the woods. I found her house empty, the door slightly ajar. Her car wasn't parked out front, which wasn't like her at all. The place looked abandoned, as though she packed up and left without a trace. Panic started to claw at me. What if she'd gone into the woods? What if she'd become like the others, lost to the darkness that was creeping into Millbrook? I wandered around the house, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The smell of stale coffee lingered in the air, a stark reminder that Emily had been here recently. But where had she gone? It was then that I noticed something odd. On the small coffee table, a notebook was open. The pages were filled with hurried scribbles, disconnected thoughts. I leaned in, trying to read the words. It's here. It's always here, watching. The forest is alive, and it calls. I can't ignore it anymore. The handwriting was erratic, frantic. Emily had always been calm, collected. This wasn't like her. I turned the page. The shadow knows my name. It's waiting for me. My heart skipped a beat. The shadow? Had she seen it too? Was this the same thing I had encountered last night? The figure in the woods? I couldn't believe it, but I had to. Emily knew something. She had to. I grabbed the notebook, desperate for more answers, when a sound, sharp and sudden, came from the back of the house. A faint creak. I froze. I was alone. The house was supposed to be empty. My mind raced, but my feet moved before I could stop them. I stepped cautiously toward the back door, my hand shaking as I reached for the knob. Another creak. This time louder, closer. I flung the door open. The backyard was empty. But then, I saw it. The woods. The dense trees, the shadows deep within them, swaying even though there was no wind. There was something moving inside, something that wasn't quite right. And there, just at the edge of the tree line, a shape appeared. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even an animal. It was a dark, amorphous figure, like the one I'd seen the night before. My pulse quickened. I knew I should run. I knew I should turn away, get back to safety. But instead, I found myself stepping forward. My legs moved of their own accord, each step dragging me closer to the woods. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence growing stronger, pushing against me like a storm. The whispering started again. It's time. I couldn't understand it. Was it calling me? Was it calling to everyone? I felt my heart beat in my throat as the shadow shifted, slowly emerging from the darkness. It wasn't just a shadow, it was something alive, something waiting. The figure swayed, flickering in and out of focus like a mirage. As it moved closer, I could feel a deep, oppressive weight in the air, pressing down on me. My legs felt heavy. I could hardly breathe. No, I thought, this isn't real. But deep inside, I knew it was. It was real, and it was here. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat, when a voice, low and guttural, slipped into my mind. It's too late to run. I stumbled backward, my hand slipping from the doorframe as I turned to flee. But before I could move, something reached out from the darkness of the woods. A cold, invisible force slammed into my chest. My breath exploded from my lungs, and I hit the ground hard. My vision blurred as I gasped for air, the pressure in my chest suffocating. I was being pulled, dragged toward the trees. I didn't know what was dragging me, but it was powerful. A force beyond anything I could understand. I tried to scream. I tried to fight. But nothing helped. The woods were calling to me, pulling me toward them. I reached out, my hands clawing at the dirt, but it was useless. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was the shape in the trees, its hollow, empty eyes watching. And then, everything went black. I woke up in a place I didn't recognize. The air was thick and cold, and the shadows stretched long across the ground. For a moment, I thought I was still in the woods, but something was different, something was wrong. I couldn't remember how I had gotten here. The last thing I remembered was being pulled, dragged toward the trees. But now, I was lying on the ground, surrounded by an unnatural stillness. The woods were gone. I pushed myself up, but my body felt weak, as if the strength had been drained from me. The cold that had once clung to my skin now seeped into my bones, filling me with an unfamiliar dread. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, and my breath came in short, shallow gasps. It wasn't just the cold. There was something else. Something watching me. I looked around. The landscape was wrong. The trees were twisted, their branches like fingers reaching out toward the sky. The ground beneath me was cracked, like the earth itself was breaking apart. The air smelled of rot, like decay was slowly consuming everything around me. And in the distance, there was a shape. A silhouette standing motionless against the horizon. It was tall, taller than any person should be. I couldn't make out any details at first, but I could feel its presence. It was watching me. I wasn't alone. I stood up, swaying, and began to walk. The silence was deafening. Not a sound, not a whisper, not even the rustling of leaves. It felt like the world had been drained of life. But there was something more terrifying than the silence. The eyes. Everywhere I looked, there were eyes. Not physically, but their presence was there. I could feel them watching me from the shadows, from the corners of my vision. They were real eyes, not in the way we understand them, but their gaze was unmistakable. Cold, empty, waiting. I tried to shake it off. I had to get out of here. I had to find Emily, find out what had happened to her. But as I moved forward, something tugged at my mind. A memory, one that didn't belong to me. It wasn't mine, but it was there, buried deep inside. The vision of a face, pale and lifeless, staring into me from the dark. A voice whispered through the fog of my thoughts. "You're already here." I froze. Already here? The words didn't make sense. I couldn't process them. But I couldn't deny it either. I wasn't supposed to be here. This place wasn't real. It couldn't be real. The figure in the distance shifted, its long, spindly limbs jerking into motion. It wasn't walking, no, it was gliding, floating just above the ground, its silhouette becoming clearer with each step. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, trapped in place by the overwhelming sense of dread. The figure was closer now, its presence towering over me, suffocating me. And then, I heard the voice. Not in my head, but from somewhere behind me, close enough to make my skin crawl. "You should not have come." I turned slowly, my heart racing. But there was nothing there. Only emptiness. The ground beneath me began to tremble. The cracks in the earth widened, and from them, shapes started to emerge, figures like shadows, but with no form. No faces, no bodies. Just emptiness. I stumbled back, panic rising in my chest. The figures were closing in. The air grew thick with an oppressive force that crushed my lungs, suffocating me with every breath. I was surrounded. It's too late. The words echoed in my mind as if they were coming from all directions. I couldn't see where they were coming from, but I could feel them. The darkness was alive. It was alive, and it was angry. I had to get out. I had to. I was yanked backward, dragged by an unseen force. My body slammed into the ground with a sickening thud, and I gasped for air as the world around me seemed to spin. The shadows closed in, surrounding me like a cage. I fought to move, to escape, but I was trapped. It's too late. The words repeated in my mind, a haunting mantra. I looked up, my vision blurred, but I could still make out the figure standing before me, its hollow eyes staring down at me. It was no longer just a figure. It was a presence. A force. A part of this world, and yet not of it. It was everything that the darkness had consumed, and now it had come for me. You are ours now, the voice said. You belong to us. I felt the cold, icy fingers of fear tighten around my chest. The figure began to move closer, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. The shadows crept forward, ready to swallow me whole. And then, I understood. This wasn't just a dream. It wasn't a trick of the mind. This place, this force, it was real. And once you entered, there was no escape. The woods had called to me, just like it had called to Emily. And now, I was a part of it. The weight on my chest felt unbearable, as though the very air was pressing down on me. I could still hear the echoes of the voice reverberating through the empty space. You belong to us. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The shadows that surrounded me felt like they were seeping into my skin, crawling under my flesh, and settling into my bones. Each second in this dark void felt like an eternity. Where are you, Emily? I whispered, my voice barely audible, swallowed by the heavy silence. But no answer came. I couldn't even hear my own heartbeat. The stillness was suffocating. The figure in front of me, this monstrous, faceless entity, was still there, but it was no longer a simple shape. It had become something much larger, more powerful. The air around it seemed to warp, shifting and contorting as if the very fabric of reality was bending. I couldn't look away, no matter how much I wanted to. Its presence was too overwhelming. Every fiber of my being screamed to run, to escape, but I knew it was futile. This place, this world, wasn't meant for escape. There was no way out. I closed my eyes, trying to shut out the terror, but it only made it worse. I could still feel it. The force. The gaze of something ancient, something that had always been here, watching and waiting. It was inside me now. There's no way back, the voice said again, low and chilling. You've crossed over. You're ours. I opened my eyes, but everything had changed. The figure was closer now, its shape less distinct but still impossible to ignore. It was taller than any man, its limbs unnaturally long, twisting like vines. Its body seemed to flicker in and out of existence, as though it wasn't bound by the rules of the world I had known. I tried to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the void. I tried to move, but my body was frozen. I was caught in a moment between the living and the dead, trapped in this nightmare with no way to wake up. Then I saw them. From the shadows around me, forms began to emerge, other figures, like me, trapped in this world. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths open in silent screams. They were moving, but they weren't alive. Not really. They were hollow shells, their souls trapped in this place, bound to serve the entity that had brought them here. "Emily?" I whispered, my voice trembling. But she didn't answer. None of them did. Their eyes, glassy and empty, fixed on me, as if they had known this fate for far longer than I had. They were the lost ones, the ones who had come before me, who had ventured too far into the woods and never returned. And now, I was one of them. I tried to push myself up, but the air was thick with a weight I couldn't fight. The ground beneath me seemed to pulse, as though it was alive, breathing. I couldn't escape. I couldn't even move. "Join us," the voice whispered again, sending a shiver through my spine. "Become one of us." I was drowning in this darkness, surrounded by the hollow souls of the lost. The longer I stayed here, the more I felt myself slipping away. My thoughts were growing dim, my memories fading. I was becoming a part of this place, a part of whatever twisted force had trapped me here. "No," I muttered, my voice barely audible. But the words had no power. I had no power. The figure moved closer, its distorted face coming into view. I could see it now, the faint outline of a face, pale and lifeless, with hollow eyes staring down at me. It was no longer a figure. It was a presence, and I could feel it pressing against me, suffocating me. "You will never leave," it said, its voice a chilling whisper in my mind. "None of you leave." I wanted to scream, to fight, but I knew it was futile. There was no escape from this. I had crossed over into a world where time didn't matter, where reality twisted and shattered like glass. This was a place where souls were trapped, lost to the shadows, forever bound to the entity that had claimed them. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and I turned in terror. The lost souls were all around me now, their cold, empty eyes staring at me as though they could see through me into the very core of who I was. They were reaching out, their hands like claws, trying to pull me into the darkness. This is it. The thought crashed through my mind. This is my end. I closed my eyes, but the cold, the darkness, the voices, they wouldn't leave. They were inside me now. "You are one of us," the voice whispered again, a final chilling breath that made my skin crawl. And then everything went black. When I opened my eyes, everything was different. I was no longer in that place, the suffocating void where time seemed irrelevant, where the air was thick with dread. It was as if I had been pulled from the very fabric of the nightmare, back to something resembling reality. The sounds of the world, the creaking of the house, the wind outside, the hum of the fridge, came rushing back into my ears, overwhelming my senses. But it wasn't real. I could feel it, deep down, that unease creeping along my spine. Something was wrong. This place, my home, the one I thought would be safe, now felt just as cold as the shadows I had escaped. I stumbled to my feet, my body heavy with exhaustion, and looked around. Everything appeared the same, my living room, the worn-out sofa, the clock ticking on the wall, but it felt distant, hollow, like a fading memory I couldn't quite grasp. "Am I still dreaming?" I whispered, my voice trembling. I took a few steps forward, each one echoing through the empty house. The walls seemed to close in around me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned, half expecting to see the faceless thing that had haunted me in the dark. But nothing was there. Still, the dread lingered. It had burrowed deep within me, like a sickness I couldn't shake off. Every shadow in the corner of my vision, every creak of the floorboards, felt like a threat. I couldn't tell if I was still trapped in that other world or if it had followed me here, leaking into my waking life, feeding off my fear. I reached for my phone, desperate to hear another human voice. But when I checked the screen, it was blank. The time was frozen at midnight. No signal. No messages. Nothing. Emily. The name escaped my lips in a breathless whisper, but there was no answer. I turned back toward the door, but something stopped me. A sound. A faint whisper, like a breath in my ear, so soft I almost didn't hear it at first. You can never leave. I froze. The words echoed in my mind, reverberating through every inch of my being. It wasn't just a voice. It was a presence. The same presence that had followed me in that dark world, the one that had claimed the lost souls. The one that had whispered its promises of eternal darkness. I spun around, heart racing. But still, no one was there. The house was silent, too silent. And then the door slammed shut on its own, the echo reverberating through the walls like a warning. I backed away, my breath shallow. This wasn't over. I knew that now. No matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape it. The darkness had followed me here. It was inside me now. It's not over, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, as if saying the words aloud could make them real. It's never over. I stumbled back to the living room, my head spinning. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and twist, flickering in unnatural ways, as if they were alive, waiting for me. I could feel their eyes on me, feel their hunger. You will join them, the voice said again, louder now, resonating inside my skull, making my teeth ache with the pressure. There is no escape. I tried to breathe, to think, to fight against it, but my mind was growing clouded. The room was growing darker by the second, and the walls seemed to be pressing in on me. I couldn't see the door anymore. I couldn't see the light. I was sinking into the same abyss, slipping back into the world where nothing was real, where shadows ruled and the souls of the lost wandered aimlessly, trapped forever. I dropped to my knees, my hands trembling as they gripped the floor. My mind raced, trying to hold on to some shred of reality, some hope that this was all just a nightmare, a terrible dream. But the coldness creeping over my skin told me otherwise. This wasn't a dream. This was my reality now. No, 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 I whispered, but it didn't matter. There was no one left to hear me. I looked up, and for a split second, I thought I saw her, Emily, standing at the edge of the shadows, her eyes empty, her face pale. But when I blinked, she was gone, swallowed by the darkness, just like all the others. We are all here, the voice whispered, its tone mocking, triumphant. I had no strength left to fight it. I had no will to resist. The coldness seeped deeper into my chest, numbing me from the inside out, and I felt myself slipping away. The shadows closed in, and I was no longer sure where I ended and the darkness began. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the faint outline of those hollow eyes, watching me, waiting for me to join them. And then, nothing. The stolen thoughts. It was the cold that woke me. The kind of cold that presses in from all sides, wrapping itself around your bones, leaving you disoriented and lost. I sat up slowly, my head heavy, my mind clouded. The room around me was dark, save for the dim glow of the streetlight sneaking through the curtains. It should have felt comforting, familiar, but something about the silence was unnerving. Where was I? I glanced around. My apartment, small, cluttered, but mine, was exactly as I remembered it. But the unease settled deeper within me as I realized that I didn't know how I got here. I couldn't recall the last few hours, or even the last day. It was as if a black hole had opened in my memory, swallowing everything. I touched my face, my skin cold to the touch, but there was no sign of injury. No bruises, no marks. Just a vague, gnawing feeling that something was wrong. I struggled to focus. The clock on the wall blinked at me, its ticking steady and reassuring in the otherwise oppressive silence. Was I alone? I turned my head to the side. The chair where my roommate, Eric, usually sat was empty. But that wasn't what disturbed me. It was the faint, lingering odor of something metallic, like blood, mixed with the damp, musty air. I froze. I couldn't see anything that would explain it. No stains, no broken glass. But the scent was unmistakable. I blinked, rubbing my eyes as though doing so would somehow clear the fog from my mind. A memory tried to break through, a flash of a face, but it was gone before I could grasp it. Just a feeling. Something important. Something that scared me. I swung my legs off the bed and stood, my legs unsteady as I crossed the room. My heartbeat quickened, as if urging me to hurry. What was I looking for? The answer to a question I couldn't fully form in my mind. I approached the window, pulling the curtain aside and peering into the street below. The neighborhood was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, and yet there was a tension in the air, something just beneath the surface that made my skin crawl. I turned back to the room, and that's when I noticed it. The mirror. It was slightly ajar, the reflection of the room distorted. But that wasn't what unnerved me. It was the fact that the reflection didn't look quite right. My eyes were where they should have been. The figure in the mirror, me, was standing too still. Almost too perfect. I blinked again, harder this time, as if trying to shake off the illusion. But when I looked back into the mirror, my reflection was gone. I froze. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing tighter, the air thick with something unspoken. The silence, once comforting, now felt suffocating. I had no idea how long I stood there, rooted to the spot, but when I finally took a step back, the mirror was as it should be, ordinary, no hint of the strange reflection I'd seen. But the unease didn't leave. In my mind, I kept hearing that voice again, soft and distant, almost as if it had come from inside my own head. It's happening again. I shook my head. Was I losing my mind? How could I be losing my mind if I didn't even know what had happened to it in the first place? I needed answers. But as I reached for my phone, I noticed something even stranger. The screen was cracked, shattered into small, jagged lines. A feeling of dread flooded through me. This wasn't normal. Something was happening here, something I couldn't explain, but it was real. I tapped the screen, but it flickered and went dark. The sense of isolation hit me like a wave. Whatever this was, I was alone in it. And then I heard the sound. A soft scraping noise, like nails running across wood. I turned, heart thumping in my chest, but saw nothing. The sound continued, though, closer now, as though something was moving in the apartment with me. Something, or someone, that I couldn't see. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. I couldn't tear myself away from that spot, paralyzed by the sensation that someone was in the room with me, watching, waiting. My breath quickened, shallow and uneven. I pressed my hand to my chest as if to steady my racing heart. "Get out." The voice was faint, almost like a whisper on the wind, but it was real. I was sure of it. I turned toward the door. My hand reached for the knob, but the moment I touched it, my mind went blank again. What was I supposed to be doing? I couldn't remember. I didn't even know how I had ended up in this moment. Everything felt wrong, and the more I tried to hold onto the pieces of myself, the further they slipped away. I was losing control. A knock at the door broke through the haze. A sudden, loud, deliberate knock. I froze. Who would be knocking at this hour? I couldn't make myself move. I couldn't trust myself to answer, not when I wasn't even sure who I was anymore. Another knock, followed by a voice I recognized. "Erica, open the door." My heart skipped a beat. It was Eric, my roommate. But there was something in his voice, something urgent, laced with fear, that made me hesitate. I slowly approached the door, my mind racing. Should I open it? Or should I run? I had to choose. But the more I stood there, the more I realized I couldn't remember what I should do. The door suddenly rattled, the sound growing louder, more insistent, as though something or someone was trying to get in. I stepped back, my hands shaking. Whatever was on the other side of that door, I had no idea if it was a person, a memory, or something else entirely. But I knew one thing for certain. The past, whatever it was, had already been stolen from me. And now, the future was not mine to decide. I didn't open the door. The knocking didn't stop, though. It came faster now, more frantic, as if the person on the other side knew I was there but wasn't getting the response they wanted. My heart thudded in my chest, the sound deafening in the otherwise silent apartment. I could feel my breath quickening again, a sense of panic flooding me as I backed away from the door. Why wasn't I answering? Why couldn't I make myself respond? The voice, Eric's voice, came again, strained and almost pleading. "Erica, please. I know you're in there. Let me in." I wanted to open the door. I knew I should. But every fiber of my being told me not to. Something was wrong. My mind was filled with a chaotic jumble of images, feelings, and half-formed thoughts. The more I tried to focus, the more distant everything felt. What was happening to me? I felt like I was disappearing, slipping through the cracks of my own mind. "Let me in, Erica." His voice echoed in my head now, not just from outside the door, but inside my own thoughts. I couldn't tell where it was coming from anymore. It was all I could hear. Over and over. The same words, but each time they sounded a little less like Eric, a little more like something else. The room started to feel colder, the walls closing in, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. I shivered, instinctively reaching for my phone again. But it was still dark, its screen cracked beyond use. I turned away from the door, my body moving on its own now, as if driven by something I couldn't control. I stumbled over to the couch, sitting down heavily, trying to steady myself. The room seemed to pulse with a heavy, unseen force, and every part of me screamed to escape. But where? There was no way out. Every door, every window felt like a trap, an extension of this suffocating space. Was I losing my mind? I looked around the apartment, desperately trying to find something familiar. Anything that would give me a clue, a sense of normalcy. But it all felt so wrong. The walls, the furniture, everything had an unnatural stillness to it. The air seemed too thick, too heavy. My skin prickled as I sat there, trapped in the silence, waiting for the next sound. For the next sign that this was real. Then it came. The whisper. It was so faint at first, I thought I had imagined it. But no! There it was again. Erica. I stood up abruptly, my breath catching in my throat. My mind was racing, trying to latch onto some sense of reality, but the whisper kept repeating my name, growing louder with every passing second. Erica, Erica. It was coming from somewhere in the room, but there was no one there. I turned to the window, hoping to see some sign of life outside, something that would convince me that I wasn't losing my mind. But the streetlights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the pavement below. And then, just as I was about to pull away, I saw it. A figure. A shadowy silhouette standing across the street, barely visible in the dim light. It was motionless, unmoving, just watching me. I froze. For a long moment, neither of us moved. But the longer I stared, the more I began to feel that it wasn't just a person standing there. It was something else. Something that didn't belong in this world. Its presence was palpable, like an electric charge in the air. No. No, this isn't happening. This isn't real. But even as I thought it, I knew deep down that it was. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. Erica. I could feel it now, in the very pit of my stomach. It wasn't just a voice, it was a command. A force pulling me, dragging me toward the darkness of the room. Toward the figure outside. But I couldn't move. My legs were heavy, my body stiff. I couldn't tear my eyes away from that figure, no matter how badly I wanted to. It wasn't just standing there anymore, it was now walking, slowly, deliberately, toward my window. I backed away from the glass, my heart racing. The figure was coming closer. Closer. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it stopped. It was as if the world had frozen, and everything went still. Too still. I reached for the door, but my hand shook as it hovered above the handle. What was happening to me? The fear was like a vice around my chest, but something in me refused to let go. I couldn't stay here, trapped in this suffocating place. But the thought of leaving, of stepping out into the unknown, was terrifying. I was losing pieces of myself, but what was the cost of finding them again? The door rattled again, this time more violently. A harsh, jagged sound that cut through the stillness like a knife. I jumped, my breath catching in my throat. My fingers wrapped tightly around the door handle, and I could feel the sweat beading on my forehead. The door pushed open of its own accord, the force too strong for me to resist. I stumbled backward, my legs weak beneath me, as the door swung open. I couldn't look. I didn't want to know what was waiting on the other side. The shadows inside the hallway seemed to stretch longer, twisting unnaturally. And then I heard it again. That voice. Erica, you can't hide from me. The darkness in the hallway seemed to pulse, like it was alive, reaching for me. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I realized the truth. I wasn't hiding from something outside. I was hiding from something inside. something inside my own mind. I don't remember when I collapsed. The next thing I knew, I was on the floor, my body trembling uncontrollably. My skin was slick with sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The room had gone quiet again. The figure, whatever it was gone. But the whispers, the voice, still lingered in the back of my mind. I could barely breathe. My thoughts were a jumble of half-formed images and fractured memories. The man at the door. The figure outside. Eric's voice, calling my name like he was standing right behind me. But he wasn't. I forced myself to sit up, my legs too weak to support my weight. Everything felt wrong, out of place. I looked around the room, the stillness too heavy. The walls were closing in, the shadows long and dark. It was as if the house itself had turned against me. I need to leave. I needed to get out of here, but I couldn't. The door was still open. The hallway beyond was shrouded in darkness, and I couldn't see past the threshold. The whispers returned, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. Erica, don't run. Don't hide. I tried to stand, my hands trembling as they gripped the edge of the coffee table. But something stopped me. It was as if my body refused to move, like my mind was locked in place, trapped in this space where nothing felt real anymore. The memory of the figure outside flashed in my mind, its shadow stretching unnaturally across the street, just staring at me. I turned toward the window, but it was dark outside now. The street was empty. No one was out there. No one except for the figure that had never really been there. A chill crawled down my spine. My breathing quickened again. Am I going insane? I wondered, my hands clutching my head as I fought the rising panic. But even as I asked myself that, I knew something else. This wasn't just in my head. I wasn't imagining it. There was something in this house, something that wasn't human. Something that wanted me. The knock on the door echoed once again, sharp and abrupt, breaking through the stillness of the moment. I froze. The knock sounded different this time. Softer, more deliberate. Almost as if it were a signal, a reminder of something I couldn't quite place. Please, don't open the door. It was my own voice. The same voice I had been hearing in my head. But why was I hearing it now, out loud? With shaky hands, I forced myself to rise, stumbling toward the door as the whispers intensified, now blending with my own thoughts. My head felt like it was spinning. My thoughts were slipping away faster than I could hold onto them. Erica, you have to open the door. You have to remember. I reached for the doorknob. My fingers trembled as they gripped it, the cold metal sending a shock of fear through me. I paused. I couldn't do this. I couldn't face whatever was waiting behind the door. But I also knew that I couldn't stay here. There was something more at play here, something I didn't understand. Open the door, Erica. The voice was clearer now, not just a whisper, but a command. A force pressing on me, demanding I obey. My breath caught in my throat as I twisted the handle, the door creaking open slowly. The hallway beyond was as dark as before, but now it felt different. More oppressive. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, crawling toward me as I stepped forward, unable to stop myself. I wasn't alone. I felt it, that presence, lurking just beyond the threshold. A sensation of being watched, of being hunted. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I hesitated, feeling the weight of something unseen. Something was waiting for me. But when I turned back toward the room, I froze. There, on the floor, where I had fallen earlier, was a small object. It was a photo. My photo. I recognized it immediately. It was a picture of Eric and me, taken just a few months ago. We were at a small cafe in the city, laughing, my head resting against his shoulder. A perfect moment in time. A moment that felt so familiar. But as I bent down to pick it up, I felt something shift in the air. A gust of cold wind swept through the room, and I knew it wasn't natural. I didn't remember putting the photo there. I didn't remember taking it out of the frame. And then, just as I reached for it, I heard the whisper again. You shouldn't have looked. I whipped around, my heart racing. But there was nothing there. No one behind me. Just the shadows. The empty hallway. But the photo, it was gone. I could feel it now, creeping in from the corners of the room, the unmistakable presence of something malevolent, something hungry. I turned back to the door. There was no turning back now. I needed to remember. And yet, the harder I tried, the more it felt like I was being pulled further away from who I was. I had to find out what happened, why I was losing myself, why I was being haunted by these thoughts. But every step I took seemed to lead me deeper into a maze of confusion. What's real? My hand trembled as I grabbed the doorframe, my mind swimming with questions I couldn't answer. And as I stepped into the hallway, the darkness swallowed me whole. I don't know how long I wandered through the house, but time seemed to stretch and warp around me. The air felt heavier with each step, as though I was moving through water, each movement slow and deliberate. The shadows had grown thicker, more aggressive, as if the very walls of this place were conspiring against me. The whispers weren't just whispers anymore. They were voices, clear and distinct, echoing in my mind, filling the empty spaces in the house. Every step I took felt like I was being led somewhere, drawn toward a truth I wasn't sure I was ready to face. You're losing yourself, Erica. I heard that voice again. It was a familiar one, but it didn't belong to anyone I knew. It felt like it was coming from inside me, as though it had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. The walls around me seemed to pulse, as if they were alive, breathing with an unnatural rhythm. I could feel the floor beneath me shift slightly, as though it wasn't solid. It was as if the very structure of the house was unraveling, bending and twisting in on itself, warping the space around me. I stumbled into the living room, my mind racing. I had to get out. The house wasn't safe anymore. But the front door was still standing open, its dark threshold beckoning me, drawing me closer to the unknown. I couldn't understand why, but the thought of leaving felt wrong. I had to stay. I had to face whatever was in here with me, or I would lose myself completely. My heart hammered in my chest as I reached the door. My hand hovered above the knob, trembling. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but something else, something deeper, compelled me to open it. I turned the handle, and the door swung open to reveal the outside world. The street was empty. The familiar, comforting street, with its rows of houses and the occasional car passing by. It was dark, the streetlights flickering in the distance, but nothing was out of place. But that's when I saw it. In the reflection of the glass, behind me, stood a figure. Tall and gaunt, dressed in a dark coat that seemed to swallow the light around it. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its presence. It was watching me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty street, the quiet night, and the eerie calm that hung in the air like a fog. Was I losing my mind? I backed away from the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. The whispers were louder now, more insistent, as though they were closing in on me from all sides. I couldn't escape. It was as if the house itself was alive, its walls closing in, its floors shifting beneath me. I could almost hear it breathing. "You're not safe here." The voice was clearer now, more distinct. It wasn't just in my mind anymore, it was coming from the room, from the house itself. I turned, and that's when I saw it. On the wall, near the hallway, was a mirror. A tall, ornate mirror that hadn't been there before. It was covered in a fine layer of dust, but the reflection was too sharp, too clear. I stepped closer, my hands shaking. The reflection wasn't mine. It was someone else, someone I didn't recognize. A woman, standing in the same room, her back to me. She was wearing a long, black dress that fluttered in the unseen wind, her dark hair cascading down her back. I reached out, my breath coming in shallow gasps. As my fingers touched the glass, the reflection shifted. The woman turned toward me, her face now visible. Her eyes were empty, nothing but black voids, endless pits of darkness that swallowed everything around them. Her lips were curled into a smile, but it wasn't a smile that belonged to a living being. It was the smile of something dead. "You're so close, Erica." Her voice was a whisper, but it felt like it was in my very bones. I recoiled, stumbling backward, but the woman didn't move. Her eyes followed me, locked onto mine, as if she was trying to pull me into that empty void. I had to get away, but my legs wouldn't move. My body felt frozen in place, trapped by the power of her gaze. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, as if the whole house were shaking with the force of them. "You have to remember, Erica." I closed my eyes, trying to block out the voice, trying to shut out the image of the woman in the mirror. But when I opened them again, the room had changed. The walls were no longer the same, the furniture had shifted, and the once familiar living room had become something else. Something darker. The shadows clung to the corners like thick, creeping tendrils, and the air was heavy, suffocating. I wasn't alone anymore. There were figures standing in the corners of the room, shapes that I couldn't quite make out. They didn't move, but I could feel their presence. They were watching me, waiting. "You're not alone, Erica." The voice was now a chorus, a cacophony of whispers that came from everywhere. It was too much. My mind couldn't process it. The room spun around me, and I stumbled to the floor, my hands clutching my head as I tried to block out the noise. I didn't know who I was anymore. I didn't know if any of this was real. And then, in the middle of the chaos, I heard a name. Eric. It was the voice I knew best. Eric's voice. I looked up, my eyes wide with fear. The room had gone quiet. I was alone. The mirror was gone. And the figures? They had disappeared. But something had changed. I could feel it in my bones. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. The darkness was with me. I couldn't tell if I was awake anymore. The line between reality and nightmare had blurred until everything felt like a distant dream. I stood in the middle of the room, trembling, my mind a storm of fragmented memories, echoes of voices that no longer made sense. Eric. The name lingered in my mind, like a weight I couldn't shake off. Why had I heard it? Why did it feel like it belonged to someone I should know? But as soon as I tried to grasp it, the thoughts slipped away, like water through my fingers. I had to leave. The front door was still open, but the outside world no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt wrong. The air tasted different, heavier, as if the very fabric of this place had been torn and rewoven into something else. I walked towards the door, my steps slow, uncertain. But as I approached, I felt the pull of something behind me. A cold breath, just a whisper across the back of my neck. I turned around quickly, expecting to see something, anything. But there was nothing. The room was empty. No. I didn't believe it. There was something here. I could feel it, just beyond my reach. Suddenly, the door slammed shut with a deafening thud. I flinched, heart pounding, and stepped back. The air around me seemed to grow thicker, suffocating, as the whispers swelled once again, this time louder and more insistent. Erica. I spun around, my breath shallow, and saw the shadows on the wall stir. For the briefest moment, I thought I saw a figure, a man, his face obscured, but his presence undeniable. The same figure that had been in my reflection. My pulse quickened as I realized that this wasn't just a haunting. This was something else. Something far more terrifying. He stepped forward, his footsteps echoing in the silence of the room. He didn't walk like a normal person. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though every step was measured, every gesture intentional. "You've been here before," he whispered, his voice deep and cold. I froze. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. What did he mean by that? Had I been here before? My mind raced, but the answer was elusive. "You've forgotten, Erica." His voice was almost kind, like a lover's caress, but it was laced with malice. My head spun. I had to remember. I had to find the truth, no matter what it cost. But then the room shifted again, twisting like a vortex, the walls stretching and pulling apart. It was as though the house itself was collapsing, folding into some other dimension. I couldn't breathe. My vision blurred, and the world around me felt like it was warping into something monstrous. I fell to my knees, my hands clutching my head as the pressure grew unbearable. The whispers were deafening now, filling every inch of my mind, until I thought I might lose myself entirely. Remember. Remember. The words were everywhere. My heart raced as flashes of fragmented images flooded my mind. The house. The figures. The mirror. And then, a face. A man's face. Eric's face. I gasped, clutching at my chest. Eric. The name finally clicked. He was the one. He was the man who had been taken. The one who had disappeared. But I hadn't forgotten him. He had never really left. I looked up, but the man was no longer standing in front of me. The room was empty again, but the air felt different. Darker. Heavy with the weight of what I had just realized. I had been the one who took him. A scream caught in my throat, but no sound came out. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of the truth that had just been revealed to me. Eric, my Eric, hadn't been stolen by some supernatural force. He hadn't disappeared into the night. No. I had taken him. I had stolen his thoughts, his memories, and left him in the void where I had once been. And now, the shadows had returned to claim what was theirs. The silence pressed in on me as the darkness grew thicker, suffocating. I was trapped in this house, trapped in this nightmare. The shadows were closing in, their whispers growing louder, their presence more oppressive. And I knew, deep down, that there was no escaping. Not anymore. The last thought that flashed through my mind as the darkness consumed me was a question. Had I ever truly been Erica? And then everything went black. The falling sky. I had never believed in the impossible. Not really. Sure, I had seen the news reports, read the stories, listened to the whispers of things beyond our understanding, but they were always just that, stories. Until last week, that is. Until the sky cracked open above California. It began as a strange ripple in the atmosphere, something I first mistook for a heat wave or some kind of bizarre optical illusion. I was standing outside, waiting for a bus, when I felt it, this sharp, cold shudder in the air. It wasn't like the usual warmth of a summer afternoon, nor the electric buzz of a coming storm. No, this felt different, almost alive. As if the air itself had been torn and was now struggling to put itself back together. The first objects began falling a few hours later. They weren't meteorites, at least not in the traditional sense. They didn't burn up in the atmosphere, they just appeared, seemingly from nowhere, crashing to the ground in a violent explosion of dust and debris. Some were small, no bigger than a fist, while others were larger, the size of a refrigerator. What struck me, though, was the way they looked, nothing like anything I had ever seen before. Some were crystalline, others liquid, and a few, like the one that landed just outside my apartment, seemed to be made of pure darkness, as though the very concept of light was being absorbed into them. The authorities were quick to set up barriers around the areas where the objects had fallen, but of course, that did little to stop people from venturing closer. Curiosity, they say, killed the cat. But it wasn't just curiosity that drew people in, it was something deeper, something that no one could explain. I found myself at the site of the first fall the next morning, my mind racing with questions. Why was this happening? What did it mean? And more importantly, could anyone stop it? I had read about strange phenomena before, but this was beyond anything I could have imagined. I crouched down beside the object, taking a cautious step toward it. It was a perfect sphere, translucent yet impenetrable, like glass, but somehow more organic. It pulsed with a faint light, flickering every few seconds like a dying star. I could feel the pull of it, like it was calling me, though I wasn't sure why. "Don't touch it," a voice shouted from behind me. I turned quickly to see a man running toward me, his face pale, eyes wide with panic. Before I could respond, the man reached me and grabbed my arm, pulling me away from the object. "It's dangerous," he muttered, his voice shaking. "They say it changes you. The ones who touched it, they're not the same anymore." I tried to shake him off, confused by his sudden outburst. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice sharp. But as soon as the words left my mouth, something strange happened. The world around me seemed to blur. The edges of the buildings, the sidewalk beneath my feet, even the man's face, all began to stretch and warp like the scene from a dream. I blinked, trying to clear the fog in my mind, but it only got worse. My stomach lurched as I felt myself falling, not physically, but mentally, into some sort of abyss. My vision swam, the colors melting together, until everything faded to black. When I opened my eyes again, the world was different. The sun was setting, but it wasn't the same shade of orange I knew. It was a deep, unnatural red, like the entire sky was on fire. The air had a strange, metallic taste, and I could hear something faint but persistent, a hum, almost like a machine running in the distance. I looked around in confusion. Where had the man gone? The people who had been nearby, the cars on the street, they were all gone. In their place was an empty, desolate landscape that I didn't recognize. Had I fallen asleep? Had I passed out from the shock? But everything felt wrong. The ground beneath my feet was cracked, as if it had been scorched. The buildings were twisted, as though they had been stretched out of shape, and I could smell smoke in the air. I staggered to my feet, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but my mind was clouded, and my body felt heavy, like I was moving through water. I reached up to touch my face, and that's when I realized something else had changed. My reflection in a nearby window wasn't mine. The person staring back at me was familiar, but wrong. Her eyes, no, my eyes, were darker, and her face, though still mine, was hollow, as if the person I used to be had been erased and replaced with something else. I backed away from the glass, my heart racing. What had I done? Had I touched the object? Had I triggered this nightmare? But before I could answer myself, a new sound filled the air. Faint at first, like a distant whisper, but growing louder. I spun around, but there was no one there. It was coming from above. I looked up. The sky, no, the atmosphere itself, was trembling, rippling like the surface of water disturbed by a stone. And then, another object fell. This one, much larger than the others, and it was heading straight for me. I stood frozen, my mind racing as I tried to process what was happening. What was it? Why was it falling? And what would happen if it touched me this time? I had no answers. Just the certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. I woke up again. Or at least, I thought I did. The ground beneath me was cold, and the air felt too thin. As if I wasn't fully breathing the same air as before, as though I were floating on the edges of reality. I could feel my heart pounding against my chest, too fast, too loud. My hands were shaking, my head spinning, and every step I took felt heavier than the last. The sky above me was wrong. That red tint had deepened, the clouds swirling like oil on water, twisted and unnatural. But it wasn't just the sky, it was everything. The buildings, the trees, even the pavement beneath my feet seemed to have been changed, reshaped, like someone had taken a rubber stamp to the world and pressed down too hard. I didn't know what was real anymore. I stumbled forward, trying to get my bearings. The sounds of the world felt muffled, like I was underwater, but underneath that, there was a steady hum. It pulsed, low and constant, vibrating through the very air around me. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I was being watched. I had no idea where I was, but someone, was drawing me toward it. A strange pull, a magnetic force. I glanced back toward the shattered glass of the storefront, where my distorted reflection had been. The figure in the window was still there, a hollow version of myself, but now it was moving. I blinked. The figure wasn't a reflection anymore. It was a person standing right outside the glass. A woman. She had the same pale, hollow eyes I'd seen in the reflection earlier, and her mouth was moving, though no sound came from it. Her hands pressed against the glass, like she was trying to get my attention, trying to warn me. I didn't understand. Was this me? Was this a vision? Or was it someone else entirely? My head throbbed with the effort to make sense of it all, but the more I tried, the less it made sense. I reached out toward the glass, my fingertips brushing against it, and the instant I made contact, everything shifted again. The world around me rippled, the edges of everything blurring, distorting. The woman's face contorted into something horrific, stretching unnaturally, like it was dissolving into the air. A violent noise erupted from the object falling above me, louder than before. A crack, like thunder, shook the ground, and the pulse in the air seemed to intensify, like the very atmosphere was breathing. I spun around. The object, the huge one that had been falling toward me, had landed. It didn't just crash. It sank into the earth, leaving a jagged crater in its wake. The sky above me seemed to shudder in response, the red color deepening, turning black at the edges. The hum in the air became deafening, reverberating through my bones. I took a step back, but then I saw it. From the center of the crater, a dark shape began to emerge, rising up slowly, as if it had been waiting, hidden, until now. It was difficult to make out at first, like smoke twisting in the air, but as it solidified, it became clear, an enormous, shapeless mass, pulsating and shifting like liquid shadow. I felt the pull again. Not physical, but something deeper, something primal. It called to me, the air itself pulling me toward the thing in the crater. No, this isn't real, I whispered to myself, shaking my head, trying to force the thoughts to stop. But they wouldn't. The hum, the pull, the dark mass, I couldn't resist. I had to go closer. As I stepped toward the edge of the crater, my legs felt heavy, like I was moving through molasses. Every movement became more sluggish, and my vision began to blur. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to run, but my body refused. It felt like my thoughts were slipping away from me, like something was tampering with them, slowly erasing pieces of who I was, one memory at a time. I fought to keep my focus, to hold on to the fragments of myself that still remained. But the pull, it was stronger now. The black shape in the crater seemed to grow, tendrils of shadow stretching outward toward me, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. And then I understood. This wasn't just a fall. This wasn't just an object from the sky. This was a shift. A break in reality itself. I wasn't just touching something from the sky. I was touching something ancient, something that had been waiting, buried, hidden beneath the fabric of existence. And it was changing everything. As I reached out, just an inch away from the edge of the shadowy mass, a voice whispered in my mind, a voice that wasn't mine. You are not supposed to be here. My breath caught in my throat. I pulled my hand back, but the voice persisted. It grew louder, the words becoming clearer. You should have never touched it. I staggered back, my mind reeling, but I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being drawn deeper into the mystery. I needed answers. But what had I really touched? What was it doing to me? I stumbled away from the crater, trying to force my body to move faster, to get away. But the sky, no, the world itself, seemed to warp around me, like a painting running out of space. The noise was deafening now, and everything started to blur. My thoughts scrambled, slipping through my fingers like sand. And then, everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, the world had changed. Not the sky. It was still that sickly red, twisted with dark, swirling clouds, but the ground beneath me, it was different. It wasn't the cracked pavement I'd been standing on before. No, this was softer, the ground more like dirt, like a forest floor, but I wasn't in a forest. I was standing in the middle of a street. Or what used to be a street. The houses, the buildings around me were familiar but distorted, like they'd been stretched or shrunk in odd proportions. I couldn't make sense of it, but I could feel the unease crawling under my skin, that familiar hum vibrating in the air. Something was wrong more than before. The sensation of time was off. My watch was gone. My phone, too. It was as if the world had been restructured around me, and I was no longer sure of what was real or what wasn't. I tried to take a step, but I stumbled, disoriented. My head was spinning, and my body felt sluggish, detached, like I was moving underwater. Every movement felt unnatural, as if I wasn't supposed to be here. The air was thick with tension, almost like static, a pressure building in my chest. But then, it happened again. The hum, the pulse that had been echoing ever since I touched that thing, intensified. I could hear it now, not just inside my head, but around me, vibrating through the air itself. I looked up, and there it was. The object. It wasn't falling anymore, but I could feel its presence. It had landed somewhere close, somewhere in this broken world I couldn't understand. But it wasn't just the object that was causing this distortion. It was the shadow, the dark mass that had emerged from the crater, that thing I had touched. The more I thought about it, the more I realized the truth. I wasn't in the same place anymore. The time, the space, it was all fractured. Everything had splintered apart, warped by whatever I had made contact with. The very fabric of reality had been altered. I tried to move forward again, but the world shifted. I staggered, feeling as though I was being pulled back, as if the ground beneath me was refusing to let me go. Then, I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of a distorted building, watching me. I froze. It wasn't a person. It couldn't be. This figure, this thing, was wrong. Its outline was jagged, shifting constantly like it was made of smoke or liquid, and it moved in jerky, unpredictable patterns. Its shape was never fully defined, but I could feel its eyes on me. I could feel it watching, waiting. The air around me thickened, and I could almost hear its thoughts, pressing against my own mind, whispering something in a language I couldn't understand. I knew I wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't my world anymore. I had to leave. But every time I tried to move, something stopped me. It was like the world itself was holding me in place, forcing me to stay, forcing me to experience this fracture. But there was something else, something worse. The figure was not just observing. It was moving toward me, closing the distance between us with each passing second. Its presence was suffocating, its form fluctuating, always changing, always uncertain. I backed away slowly, but the hum grew louder, and the shadow flickered, twisting in unnatural ways, like it was warping the very space around it. And then, I heard it. A voice, soft at first, like the rustle of wind through trees. "You cannot escape," it said, the words hanging in the air. I spun around. The world around me cracked and shifted. I could feel the pull again, stronger this time, as if the very ground was pulling me down, sinking me into something dark and cold. The figure took another step closer. The air seemed to bend, distort around it. The world was coming apart, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. My legs wouldn't obey me. I was frozen, unable to move. All I could do was watch as the figure loomed closer, its face starting to form, a featureless mask, covered in strange symbols, glowing faintly. And then, the world fractured completely. The figure, the landscape, the air, it all dissolved into a blur, and I fell, deeper and deeper, into the abyss of shifting realities. I tried to scream, but my voice was lost. I was falling. Or was I floating? The sensation was so strange, so disorienting, that I couldn't tell which one it was. It felt like time had stopped entirely, and yet everything around me kept shifting, blurring into a chaotic whirl of colors, shapes, and distorted sounds. The weight of the air around me was thick, oppressive, pressing down like a physical force. Every moment stretched out, but I couldn't grasp anything solid. I could see flashes of images, fragments of memories, of moments that felt like they had been ripped from my past. Faces I recognized, places I'd been, all twisted and fragmented, like pieces of a broken puzzle scattered across my mind. I tried to reach for them, to hold on to something familiar, but it slipped away as quickly as it appeared. Then, without warning, I hit something. The fall stopped. My body slammed against an invisible surface, a wall or barrier of some kind, and I gasped, my breath sharp in the stillness. The world around me was silent now. The hum, the pulse I had been feeling, had faded, leaving nothing but a deafening quiet. I blinked, trying to adjust to the sudden shift in reality. My vision cleared, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I saw something solid. I was in a room, no, a space, but not a room in any conventional sense. It was empty, vast, stretching out in every direction, its boundaries indeterminate. The floor beneath me was made of a smooth, almost reflective material, but there was no light source, no sky above, nothing except the strange, undulating walls that seemed to ripple with some unknown force. I looked around, feeling my heart race in my chest. I didn't know where I was. I didn't even know how I was here. But then, I saw it. A figure, one I hadn't expected. It was standing in the distance, its silhouette barely visible, distorted like the rest of this place. But this one wasn't like the shifting figure I had encountered before. This one seemed more solid, more real. I instinctively took a step back, my body tense with fear, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, unmoving, like it was waiting for me. For a moment, I considered turning and running, but I knew it wouldn't make a difference. I had nowhere to go. The space was endless, and the figure, despite its eerie stillness, exuded a strange presence. It wasn't threatening, not in a physical sense, but something about it made my skin crawl. Like it knew something I didn't. Then, the silence was broken. A voice, deep and resonant, reverberated through the air, though the figure didn't move its lips. "Do you understand what has happened to you?" The words echoed around me, vibrating through the walls. My pulse quickened. I wanted to respond, but my throat felt tight. The words were stuck in my chest. "You have crossed the boundary," the voice continued, a strange calmness to it, as though the being was stating a simple fact. "You are no longer in your world. This place is not for the living. It is a place between places, a space outside time and memory. You are here because you touched it. The object. The thing that had fallen from the sky, that had shattered reality itself." My mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments, but it felt like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. "You are not the first," the voice continued. "There have been others, many others. But they were not chosen as you were. They were lost, trapped in this space, their minds shattered and scattered. The object you touched has a purpose, but you have not yet seen the full picture." I didn't understand. What purpose? What was it doing to me? To all of us? "Time here is not the same as it was," the voice intoned. "What you think is real is no longer real. You are caught in a rift, a distortion, and you will remain here unless you can learn how to navigate the fracture. I swallowed hard, the weight of the words pressing down on me. How could I navigate this place? How could I escape? I had no answers, no direction. I was lost, floating in this vast, empty space, with nothing but the strange figure in front of me, watching, waiting. But then the figure took a step forward, and I froze. It wasn't the same figure that had appeared before. It was different, taller, more defined, its outline clearer now, but still unsettling, as though it was not quite real. "You must listen," it said, its voice colder now, more insistent. "The fracture will consume you if you do not. You are here for a reason, but that reason is not what you think." The tension in the air thickened. I could feel it now, pressing against my chest, the weight of everything bearing down on me. The figure moved closer, and despite my fear, I felt an odd pull toward it. Something in its presence demanded my attention. My body moved of its own accord, step by step, until I was standing right before it. "There is no escape without sacrifice," it whispered, the words echoing in my mind. "But are you willing to give up what you are? What you know? Or will you remain in the fracture forever?" The question hung in the air like a heavy fog, the truth of it sinking in. What was I willing to lose to escape? What was I willing to sacrifice to get back to my world? And what if there was no escape? What if this was the price of touching the object? What if my life, my reality, had already been altered beyond recognition? The figure reached out a hand, an invitation, or perhaps a warning. I hesitated, my heart pounding, the decision weighing on me. And then the world cracked again. The ground beneath my feet trembled, and I staggered, trying to keep my balance. The figure's hand, still extended toward me, seemed to blur in and out of existence, as though it wasn't entirely anchored in the world. The trembling intensified, a low hum building from deep within the space, vibrating through my very bones. My head spun with the realization that everything was unraveling. The figure's voice, now distorted and unsettling, echoed in my ears. "Time is the currency here, and you've spent it all." I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, my mind flooded with 1,000 questions, but there was no time to process them. The world was cracking open again, the reality itself seeming to fold, tear, and shift. Was this it? Was this the end? Or was it just the beginning of something worse? A place between places, between time, where nothing made sense anymore. I looked at the figure's outstretched hand, then back at the space around me. There was no escape, no clear path forward. The floor was no longer a solid surface, but a rippling mass, like liquid glass, shimmering with fragments of memories, my memories, flashing across it. Images of my past life, distorted and broken, played out in front of me like a film on fast forward. I reached for the figure's hand instinctively, not fully understanding why, not understanding the price I might pay. The moment my fingers brushed against its cold surface, everything around me shattered. The space itself seemed to collapse, folding in on itself, swirling with violent speed. I was ripped from this strange, otherworldly place, pulled backward with such force that I felt like I was being torn apart. The sky itself cracked open, splitting into pieces, and I was falling once more, but this time there was no sensation of weightlessness. I hit the ground hard. For a moment, everything was still. My head throbbed, my vision blurred, and I struggled to sit up, the weight of the world pressing down on me. When my eyes cleared, I was no longer in that strange, infinite space. I was back in California, my California. But it wasn't the same. The sky above me was wrong, darker than it should be, with swirling clouds that seemed to pulse as though alive. The air smelled thick, unfamiliar, and there was a strange buzzing sound like electricity crackling in the distance. The world around me felt off. I couldn't place it, but it was like stepping into a nightmare where nothing made sense. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and glanced around. The landscape was the same: houses, streets, trees, but everything had a twisted, unreal quality to it. Shadows stretched unnaturally long. The light had a strange tint, like it was filtered through an otherworldly lens. I could hear distant voices, muffled and distorted, echoing from far away. But there were no people. Where was everyone? Had they all disappeared? I walked through the empty streets, trying to make sense of the scene around me. The silence was suffocating. The world felt hollow, like a stage set where nothing was truly real. The very ground beneath my feet seemed to shift with every step, as though I wasn't walking on solid earth, but something more fragile. My mind reeled. I had touched the object. The thing that had fallen from the sky. That thing had changed everything. And now, I wasn't sure what was left. A movement caught my eye. At the end of the street, I saw a figure standing under the glow of a street lamp. It was a man, tall, wearing a dark coat. But there was something wrong about him. He was too still, too perfect, as though he was a part of the distorted reality around me. I felt an overwhelming urge to go toward him, to ask him what had happened, to demand answers. But with each step I took, the figure seemed to retreat further into the shadows. It was like he wasn't moving at all, but the distance between us kept growing. The buzzing sound intensified, louder now, rattling my brain. The sky above me shifted again, the clouds swirling more violently, twisting into unnatural shapes. I felt a coldness creep up my spine, and I knew that this wasn't my world anymore. I had crossed a line, touched something I wasn't supposed to touch, and now I was trapped in a version of reality that wasn't my own. I had to find out what happened. I had to find a way to fix this. I took a deep breath and ran toward the figure, my pulse racing. The air around me crackled, and I felt a strange pressure building in my chest, as if the very fabric of this place was pressing against me. Every step was harder than the last, as though the world itself was trying to keep me from moving forward. Finally, I reached the street lamp. But when I looked up, the figure was gone. No trace of him. Nothing but the swirling shadows. Then, out of nowhere, a voice echoed through the emptiness, a voice that I instantly recognized, though I couldn't place where I had heard it before. "You cannot escape, not now." I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice wasn't the figure's, but it was eerily familiar. My thoughts raced, but the words wouldn't form. I couldn't see where the voice was coming from, but I knew it was watching me. The space around me started to collapse again, the ground beneath my feet warping, cracking, as though the reality was tearing itself apart. I felt the pull again, the same sensation from before, the fall, the shift, the endless twisting of everything I knew. And then, with a violent jolt, the world went dark. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.